Oh my god, is it actually going to work? Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Perspective Philosophy, at least the fourth time in about 15 seconds. So I hope you're all having a lovely night. Essentially, tonight I am going to be reacting to Destiny's moral breakdown. Hopefully, this time it will actually go as planned. If you are part of the last three streams that failed, one was my fault and two weren't my fault and had more to do with Streamlabs and YouTube. But essentially, if you're new here, I am a PhD student in philosophy and I have a BA and MA in philosophy, and I'm going to be reacting to Destiny's moral system. Essentially, I'm going to see if I can add anything to the conversation and hopefully add some value as well. I'm going to be checking whether he's using his philosophy and whether he's talking philosophy correctly and whether he's logically consistent and sound. So let's get into this. So yeah, and for everyone who was part of the last stream which failed, and the stream before which failed, and the stream before which failed, thank you for sticking around. I really appreciate it. I'm sure you aren't. I'm sure you're very surprised actually at technical issues on this channel. They are very rare. So yeah. But yeah, so, and as well, just before we start, if anyone's interested in learning, interested in a comprehensive introduction to Western philosophy, then check out my Discord server where you can enter a raffle to win essentially an upcoming course, a comprehensive introduction to Western philosophy, delivered by myself, who paid over £40,000 for that knowledge and had to do it for over 5 years to put in more than I'm actually getting. So you're actually getting something for free if you win. That took me the majority of my professional life. So yeah, good luck. And if you're interested in donating to the channel and helping me maybe pay for a team, or you want to make a comment or a question in relation to this video, check the donation link below and you can see that there will be an option to leave a message or ask a question, which will most likely get answered at the end of this reaction. Thank you for sticking around, and hopefully we can have a nice reaction to Destiny's system. So yeah, let's get into it, guys.
I don't think you should ever kill a human being ever. Well, except in that case. Okay, well, wait, hold on. Clearly, you don't believe that then. There's something else you believe. Let's get to the root of that. Let's find out what you actually, right? My general belief is, I feel like if you have a certain political position, I feel like it should be justified. What I mean is, I feel like we should have logical...
Just out of curiosity, guys, the audio coming through okay? Just to make sure this time, everything going all right? Just make sure that's going all right. Like you can hear me still. Echo. Right. Sweet. Thanks, man. Right.
Coherent and consistent ways by which we take questions, apply some rigorous moral standard to them, and then generate answers that will be consistent with the answers that we'd give to any other question. So there's two parts to this. One, if something is not consistent, it is meaningless. Okay? What I mean is that in any given system, you have rules.
So I mentioned this in the last reaction bit that I did. Essentially, I really like that he marries ethics and politics as they should be. Aristotle was the first to do this, where he showed that human behavior in ethics is essentially ethikos, how we, pertaining to behavior, is essentially in relation to how we live our lives on a more grandiose scale. So when I behave in a certain way and I try and achieve the good life for me, and the only way to achieve the good life for me, according to Aristotle, is to achieve the good life for man, which ultimately puts it into the realm of politics. But even if I was just trying to achieve the good life for me, how would I achieve the good life for me is a question which always overlaps into politics. And when we talk about politics anyway, what we are talking about is how we should live, how we should govern our state, how we should make, whether we should or should not, make some sort of political action. It's always ethically grounded. So to divorce the two is nonsense. Like always must marry ethics and politics. So I'm really happy he does that. And as I said before, if he's talking propositions when he's talking about inconsistency, then yes, he's right. An inconsistent or incoherent proposition with multiple parts which contradict one another creates a nonsense statement which cannot be understood. However, if you can have statements which are expressive, which can have contradictory expressions in them, and arguably they are meaningful. So, for example, some people argue religious expressions are like this. Some people argue that emotive expressions are typically like this. So, yeah.
Rules for that system. If you decide that you can break some rules, then you could break any rule, because it doesn't make sense to have a system where some rules can be broken. That means that you're actually using another system.
Well, that's not the case. So one of the main things about this is that every single law-based structure usually has its exceptions. Okay, even in the natural laws of the universe, we typically see that there are exceptions to the rule given certain physical circumstance. The ideal gas laws, for example, break down. I think it's in relation to certain temperatures and pressures. And this doesn't mean that they're not rules. This just means that they are our best description of the universe in a certain state, and then there are certain states which do not, which are not expressed correctly under these rules. Now, it is accurate to say that. However, to say that you're not following a rule or you're being inconsistent if you break a rule under certain stated circumstances is incorrect. You could have a system of rules which has certain exceptions, logically grounded exceptions, in relation to social circumstances for consequences or rules, or deontologic, or the consequentialism or deontology. The consequences, for example, may be that there is a threshold in which the consequences of a certain, or to a certain class of individuals or a certain type of individual becomes too great, or even the consequences to yourself in terms of egoism may become too great and you would not follow the rule anymore. Or I will not follow this rule anymore, even though I believe that is ethical to do so because it is disregarding my own subjectivity and therefore it's contradicting with maybe another rule or the consequences, an aspect of the consequences that I think is unjustified. Or it could be something like Thomas Aquinas' double effect. Essentially, you can have two conflicting duties, and in one circumstance you follow a rule, and in another circumstance you would also follow a rule. But in this circumstance, both rules are applicable, but you can only follow one. In which case, you follow the rule which is of the greatest moral weight. That's not to say that either of them aren't rules. It's to say that you can have confliction of rules and conflicting duties in various scenarios, and they be rules and that you should follow, but you're unable to. So it's not to say that they aren't justified rationally. It's to say that they can be rational exceptions to the rule-based system. So he's wrong there.
Right? Does that make sense? Like, if you're saying, like, okay, I don't think that you should ever kill a human being ever. Well, except in that case, okay, well, wait, hold on. Clearly, you don't believe that then. There's something else you believe. Let's get to the root of that. Let's find out what you actually, right? So it's important to have a system where all the rules they make sense. I'm sorry, when I say they make sense, where all the rules are consistent, so you always follow them. They're like, you have to do.
Yeah, he is right there. Like, if we're talking about simply the principle of explosion, the rules must be consistent to logic. And so long as we're applying logic correctly, then that's fair enough. And so long as the system is consistent with itself, and that's what validity is. However, there also has to be soundness in relation to whether we actually should or should not follow rules. But when we talk about whether the rules are actually valid as being rules, that's what I would say. So if you're saying that a rule must make great as the amount of the rules, and that's essentially how it's being applied, then yeah, absolutely.
Do this, otherwise it falls apart, and then you should be consistent throughout the entire rule set. If you believe that you can't do something, that should be consistent throughout all the whatever, blah blah blah, with reasonable additions, changes. You need to be consistent. It needs to be logically coherent. When I try very hard to do this, even though I don't know if anybody believes this, when I say the word logical or rational, what I mean by that is like premise, conclusion. So if I say you have a logically coherent argument, I might say something like, you should never kill somebody unless you're threatened. Joe represented a threat to Susan. Therefore, Susan can kill Joe. Something like that, right? Like it should follow like either a syllogism or some like reasonable pattern of like, oh, well, if I believe these three things, then this conclusion logically follows. Any moral system you have should be logically coherent, okay?
Yeah, so what logical means is essentially conforming to the laws of logic, that you don't make any contradictions, that everything is equal to itself, and essentially making sure that the way in which you, like, I know it sounds, essentially it's almost common sense when you look at it. For the most part, it is actually quite rare that people make errors actually structuring a sentence, but when to make incoherent. But it happens. So an incoherent sentence would be an incoherent premise would be a premise in which there is an internal contradiction within that premise. So that you say something like, it was a light dark day, or like it was as black as white. That would be incoherent. Or you could say, and then obviously there is a logical entailment, and I think that's what he's trying to say with premise, conclusion. So that like, it actually implies. So premise, conclusion, the two premises actually imply the conclusion. So A, if A, then B, B, A, then B. So like, if P, then Q, P, Q. That's essentially the most basic kind of logical inference that you can kind of find.
Like makes sense when you line all the statements up, and it should be consistent. You like have the same set of rules you apply everything to.
I'm getting a Destiny art.
Okay. Ideally,
gave him money.
I would ask. So I feel like when people are asked a question, how do you feel about this thing? There's usually two things that people's minds go to. One is, do I have a visceral reaction to it? Right? So if I say, how do you feel about eating shit? Oh, fuck. I have a sense. I've got a sense that like immediately says this is bad. It's the first thing people appeal to. And then the second thing people appeal to is, what is the correct answer that I'm supposed to give given the groups that I belong to? I think that that's the second answer you give. When people run out of those two things, most people don't actually have a rigorous process by which they can evaluate.
Well, I mean, you've made a very big mistake, haven't you? You've asked how they feel about it. And this is a very important question. I mean, the whole point when we talk about a system being valid is one thing, logically consistent. But when we talk about soundness, we talk about whether it actually corresponds with reality. So whether it is actually the case that ethics is like this. So if we make an ethical statement, let's say, or like a meta-ethical statement like morality is objective, the only way that is sound, I could make an argument that is consistent, like, I don't know, morality is objective if I'm a wizard. I'm a wizard, morality is objective, right? It's valid, right? It's not sound. I'm not actually a wizard, guys. I don't know if you knew that, right? But that's essentially a very big difference. When you ask someone how they feel about something, you've basically kept it like they've kept morality in that kind of realm of emotivism or expressivism. You've said like what is right and wrong is determined by their actual emotional expression. So if you say like, how do you feel about something? So like, well, what is right is in relation to how you feel. At least that's implicit, I would argue. And then if you say like it's related to a group or ideology, then what you've also related to is maybe moral cultural relativism. If I was asking someone about their moral system, I would say like, ask them maybe an applied moral question, like, do you think you are justified to act this way? That would be like how I would ask an ethical question. It would be about justification. And then they can talk about, well, I feel, and then we could talk about that. But if you're asking someone about a system in general, talk about justification. Don't talk about feelings, because they're always going to then, relate it to what he said, either their own emotional states or a group or an ideology. But that's not necessarily saying that there isn't an actual fact of the matter.
Whether something is good or bad, or whether they do or don't like something. I think that's like that's something that I strongly believe in. Maybe people will disagree with that, but yeah. So for instance, if I say, how do you feel about socialized healthcare? Well, we don't have an initial like a sense response to that. Okay, well, what groups do I belong to? Okay, I'm a liberal, I'm a blah, 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 blah. Oh, okay, cool. I like universal healthcare, right? That's generally.
That's actually it's actually really interesting. Beyond this conversation, in politics, there is what we call cultural hegemony. Cultural hegemony is the process in which an individual understands themselves in relation to the group they are in. It's basically created by a guy called Antonio Gramsci, was one of the first people to come up with it, and it basically goes like this: power creates people create power just as much as power creates people, right? So and a person is essentially given an ideology and then understands how to behave in relation to the ideology in which they are given. I understand how to behave if I'm a Marxist in relation to other Marxists and the group dynamic that is formed there. What do other Marxists do? So whoever controls the normativity of that group controls the behavior of the individuals below it. So this is how he was trying to explain like how people could be fascists. Like how could someone just fall into fascism? And he was imprisoned by the fascists, by the way, so it's kind of political relevance to him. And so he basically thought that it wasn't that people were thinking about how to be a fascist, it's that fascism ideologically bound itself to their way of thinking and then told them how to behave. They didn't think that I want to be a fascist and I want to behave this way. They ad hoced their behaviors onto whatever conceptual identity they already had. So they moved from one group to another. That group then told them how to behave, and they go around like robots behaving in such a way. And we can only escape this via reason, essentially.
Really it. Now, they might think they know some justifications, but really what they're doing is they're just going to repeat what they heard from the group, knowing that they have to support it, because it's the group or whatever. What I want is I want to have some internal system that I've designed that allows me to take moral questions and generate moral answers, okay? Like, that's important to me. That's very important to me. It's one of the most important things to me. So how do we do this, okay? The very first question that we have to start off at, we have to go all the way back, okay, is we have to ask, what is goodness? Like, what do we consider?
All right, we're back at ancient Greece. What is the good? What does it mean to do what is good? So yeah, like that is a question that was really first asked at the times of arguably before Plato and the pre-Socratics, but was a very particular question and a universal proposed by Socrates in the early Socratic dialogues. Gorgias, Protagoras, they essentially focus on what is goodness.
Considered to be the good. In my actual opinion, this question is unanswerable. This is a question that the answer to this question is going to draw on something external of like human knowledge. Good is an ill-defined concept.
Something external like human knowledge. I don't understand what he means by that. So like, for example, everything that we talk about in general draws upon human knowledge. So like, my understanding of the sun being the sun isn't given to me by my sense experience. It's given to me by my conceptual schemata, which allows me to create like arguments and understand arguments and then perceive what that glowy ball thing in the sky is as the sun. And I understand that it's a ball of gas that is being compressed by gravity to super high temperatures, forcing atoms into each other of hydrogen that fuse into helium, releasing a mass amount of energy, creating an incredible amount of solar radiation, which then, warms the atmosphere and so on. And a plethora of other things in relation to, astrophysics, right? Now, none of them are immediately available to me, and all of them are structures of knowledge that have been built up through investigation, both rational and empirical. And so, like, when we talk about what is goodness is unanswerable because it relies upon knowledge, well, like, so does everything, whether it's no matter what epistemological epistemic field it is, whether it's a form of science, whether it's a form of mathematics, whether it's a form of whatever, there is going to be a dependence upon human investigation. You're not going to get that otherwise. So I don't know what he means there.
I don't believe that there's an actual answer, blah, 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 blah. So I have like my own little answer for goodness, basically, okay? And I'll walk you through this a little bit, okay? So since I don't believe that there is like an objective good, truthful, good, moral, whatever, I'm not religious. I don't believe in any sort of like moral realism or objective moral truth because I don't think that we have ways to feel or see morality. I don't think we can sense it or detect it or argue about it. Basically what I do is...
See, He's talking about goodness. It is very Greek and very Platonic, actually. So good is an object to be sensed. Good is not something that we can understand rationally or in relation to something that we are already perceiving. That's a very Platonic view of good. It's a form of the good. It's abstract, universal, which is intangible, imperceivable. Okay. However, you get other people like Aristotle, for example, just after Socrates, after Plato, who talk about goodness in relation to human nature, something which we already, and humanity itself. So something that we are already perceiving, an object and its characteristics, which arguably give us an understanding of good. And he would say that, for example, an individual's basic nature is where we get this understanding of good, something that we can perceive and sense. So when he's saying that we talk about goodness as being imperceivable, well, it depends on what you think goodness is. And if you were to be very basic about it, you could argue that when people, say statements about goodness, what they're doing is making statements about value responses at the very least, in which case we are talking about notions of subjectivity, which we can all perceive. So he's talking about goodness already as if it's an ontologically objective, not ontologically objective in the sense that it's like in an Aristotelian way, but ontologically objective in a Platonic way. It's transcendent.
I say that there are things that I have that I want to fulfill in my life that make me happy. Those things are, to me, those things are good. So I basically have some like internal happiness. I try to maximize and fulfill my own internal happiness. Well, I'll just call this IH. You guys have to remember what this shit stands for. If this is like what I'm trying to maximize, right? My goal is to live a life where I can satisfy this like internal happiness as much as humanly possible. Now, typically, okay, because I'm not a god, all right? I'm not like capable of doing most things on my own. I can't hunt on my own. I can't create clothing. I can't.
It's funny because he says that it's like in terms of objectivity that he's not a moral realist. Yet this notion of good for him is internal happiness. People like Ayn Rand, other objectivists, egoists, people like Thomas Hobbes, argue this exact same thing. But they're objectivists. They're realists. They believe that it's in relation to our being. That my sense perception of good and bad is not something that I can choose. I don't pick and choose, for example, what makes me feel good and makes me feel bad. And this internal happiness, for example, that he's speaking of, this could all be objective. He could be like a psychological egoist and this all be objective. So talking about this as if it's subjectivism could actually be wrong. This could definitely fall into the realm of egoism.
Can't build houses. There's a lot in my life that makes me happy that I need that I can't think they do. What I call internal happiness, I think they call religion or some other weird bullshit or conscience.
Actually sounds incredibly like Thomas Hobbes when he talks about basically you can only desire what you already desire. So he's basically saying that what we're doing is playing word games here. When you say that you want something that isn't your own happiness, what you're actually saying is you want something that you want. And it is the want itself that he's referring to. It is this goal, which is overall desire within the individual, which is an action-urging process, seeking a goal which is psychological satisfaction or the discharge of one's strength against the world in like a Nietzschean sense. So there's no reason why this couldn't be objective. Yeah.
Deontological, I don't care. I think that most people try to satisfy some internal preferences they have. So what I realize is I can't satisfy these on my own, so I have to satisfy these by way of interacting with other people. In order for them to be motivated to...
That is actually just Thomas Hobbes right there. That is social contract theory in relation to other individuals, because life in the state of nature is nasty, brutish, and short. Acting individualistically without considering other individuals is essentially self-defeating. So to obtain our own happiness, even in terms of means to ends relationship, will require other individuals.
Satisfy my internal happiness, I have to do something that increases their happiness as well, right? So like economics, I wouldn't say that happiness is like a zero-sum game, right? So if one person on his own can generate 5 units of happiness and another person can generate 5 units of happiness, I think that these two people coming together could generate 50 units of happiness. The more people that work together, the more overall like happiness that you get. So if I agree with this, right? So I want to be happy, and I want to maximize the amount of happiness for myself. I need to have other people around me that are capable of like feeding into my own happiness, right? I have to have like a group of people, family and friends, society, whatever you want to call it, that are capable of like satisfying the needs that I have, right? So this might be, we'll just put like house, clothes, friendship, subs. If I have my internal happiness that I'm trying to have satisfied through other people, through these things, right? I would assume that they have happiness through every person.
Yeah, that is contractarianism. My main issue, I guess, with this is that it already presupposes an ethical relationship in which I can understand an individual as being epistemologically capable of being a property owner and having their own desires and understanding them. But we'll get onto that in a minute. I think the other thing to consider is that when we talk about, for example, how he requires other individuals, you can be the sovereign, you can be the king, you can be the whatever in this scenario, in which case you can use the system as a means to an end. So like you can be part of the system, or you can be, the person who writes the normative structure. So when we talk about ideology in relation to other individuals, there could be the fascist at the top of the pyramid who does not believe in any fascism per se. They can construct the ideology, use the power mechanisms of propaganda to tell people how to live their lives in relation to each other, to create a pyramid scheme of ethics, a pyramid scheme of morality. And ultimately that would be, if arguably, the greatest place to be within the pyramid. Now, what you'd have to do is say that there was a mechanism which prevents an individual, or preventing that individual from actually achieving power over other individuals. And I'm yet to see a social contract theorist really being able to show that we don't fall into like moral cannibalism. I think people like Ayn Rand try to argue that that we don't. The needs of rational men do not contradict each other, but I do not see any evidence for that.
This is like roughly my moral view of like how the world works. I think that everybody's trying to satisfy things that make them happy individually, and I think that we do that by satisfying each other's like desires and wants, so that we all like kind of like work off of each other's happiness, make each other's happiness. Is there an argument against this idea? I think this is the best way to view things. I think that if you
there is arguments against this idea. So the main thing is this understanding of internal happiness, for example, understanding of my own desires. This is something that's not inherent. It's actually given to you by a sociocultural environment. And so the concepts in which I apply to myself are actually dependent upon other individuals and their recognition of what I am. So I understand myself as a man because of the sociocultural normative environment in which I live in, which has allowed me to apply the concept to myself of male, and then gender, man, and then so on, and it builds up into a more complex schemata, which allows me to psychologically satisfy my desires to a greater degree and understand my internal happiness responses, quote unquote, to ontologically in relation to this cultural constructed scheme, right? Now, the issue here is that if it's totally unethical, if it's totally constructed by a power system, then the very understanding of internal happiness can be a delusion. So I could be very much a devout, I could be a devotee to any religion, right? Absolutely brainwashed, and think that anything that I do in relation to this religion is going to pay off in the end. And that I see as my understanding of happiness. However, it might very well make me the most sad and depressed individual in the world because there is no grounding for that system in the first place. This is what we call in European philosophy a master-slave relationship. So a master-slave relationship is a relationship with an individual in which the goal or the outcome is determined by one side and one party. And it comes down to the point in which I understand myself as a master or a slave, and they understand themselves as a master or a slave. So my very understanding of self is determined by our interrelation. And so this is where ethics is actually first born. It's not born at the point of social contract theory. Social contract theory is actually dependent upon ethics for its constitution. And that's actually Hegel's argument against social contract theory. So what we need to have is equal recognition of each other as being able to verify and falsify what we consider these universals, good, bad, right, and wrong, in relation to our socio-political environment. Equal engagement within institutions, equal engagement with each other and recognition of each other's desires, and equal engagement on what we would consider to be the foundation of what is valuable, namely us. It has to be a universal, because otherwise it would be biased towards an individual party and be ad hoc. It would be being asserted as a notion of goodness, in which case my understanding of self could be biased towards my improper rationality. I don't know if I'm thinking correctly. Even if I'm the master, I don't even know if I'm right, because I'm not letting you verify or falsify my claims. I'm not letting you validate what I'm saying. I'm telling you what is right. So this is why master-slave relationship can actually sometimes be called a slave-slave relationship. It's only at the point in which we engage within ethics that we're actually capable of creating a system which would ultimately allow us to express this internal happiness.
You go through this model, I think it gives you a good understanding of how other people work. I think it gives you a good approach to other relationships. I think it gives you a good approach to how the world works. If we take this little mini model here to be true, from this position, we get into this kind of world where we have, I guess you could call this a form of like social contract. So basically, what this is I agree to respect some rights that you
I wouldn't have guessed the social contract.
have, and you agree to respect some rights that I have, and then by way of doing that, we all kind of like ensure this like better world for all of us. However, it should be noted, okay, the only reason, okay. That's like on an individual personal level, right? Okay.
One of the main things about this is like who signs the social contract and who's given what position within the social contract and why they should have that position. So there's no reason why a social contract is incompatible with hierarchy, in which case you can sign a social contract. It'd be in your interests, quote unquote, to be in the social contract. It could be better than being, exiled onto an island or whatever. And you would still be at, let's say, the bottom of the food chain, being absolutely exploited. You could be a slave and it'd still be better than living in a jungle. That's not really going to bring you that much happiness. So signing the social contract might be, if it's not on your terms, quote unquote, it might be unfair, in which case you could try and revolt. So it's not necessarily the case that it is better. Also, there is the point in which social contract theory is also dependent upon oh my god, where was I going with that? I think we're not actually born we're born into a social contract. We already have signed a social contract. When we're born into a state, there are already property laws, there are already various institutions which surround us. So if you are talking about a social contract from which you sign and that you've consented to, then there has to be a point in which, if you've consented to, that you could, remove your consent, refuse to sign the social contract. That doesn't exist. So in which case, with this notions of internal happiness being directly proportional to the social contract, no, absolutely not. You'd have to be able to write the laws themselves in relation to your own internal notions of happiness. But as I said before, that even your own notions of internal happiness have to be socially defined before you reach the point of a social contract. So you've already entered society.
Okay. So, all right. I would say that all of this up here, okay, roughly, all right, in the philosophy browser retrievers, I would say like roughly up here, I would call this like meta ethics, kind of, okay? Basically, I'm trying to figure out like, well, what do I consider good? Technically, it's a little bit deeper than that, but whatever, right? So this is like good, okay? This is the goodness. The goodness is other people make you happy, you make other people happy, okay? Boom. All right. Now, if I want to figure out like, how do I apply this consistently?
Yeah, I was trying to move it so that you could actually see the social contract diagram that he's wrote. But it's, I think you can see most of it. But essentially, yeah, I can't do anything about that. So I'm really sorry, guys.
Throughout all of society. How do I create a society where everybody thinks this and we all work together and everybody's happy, blah, 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 blah.
See, I mean, he's already kind of proposed a scenario in which he's controlling ideology. How can I create a society in which everyone agrees with me so that I can achieve the greatest amount of happiness for myself in relation to other people? Well, one, like, why would you want them to necessarily agree with this notion, right? Like, internal happiness for everyone, woo, kind of hippy dippy utopia, right? Why don't you instead have them agree to a society in which they enslave themselves to a doctrine in which you benefit from, which creates a pyramid scheme which ultimately benefits you and your quote unquote internal happiness, your desires, to a greater degree? You could use them, house, clothes, friendship, subs, right? Houses, clothes, and friendships. Friendships maybe less so, but houses, clothes, and subs definitely can be obtained through the means of ideology. I mean, how many individuals, for example, have used ideology to gain money? I mean, you see pastors, for example, who preach absolute nonsense, and they're multimillionaires buying private jets. When it comes to subs being politically advantageous, Hitler managed to, quote unquote, get subs, right? And he was top of the food chain in that respect. Talking about friendship, okay, it's a little bit more difficult. That's social interactions, but whether that's a system as a whole and how we are actually meaning to achieve it is the means to friendship, arguably might not actually be. Depends on how we define friendship.
Blah. We're gonna call this little bullshit is basically this is gonna be something called rule utilitarianism, okay, which is like a little branch of consequentialism. So this is a fancy way of saying what I would want to do is I want to craft a set of rules for society, okay, that I believe maximizes the happiness of every single individual. A rule here might be something like, I don't think anybody should steal from anybody else without provocation. Because if we have a society, for instance, where people are stealing, right, you're literally detracting from another person's happiness for your own selfish gain. And if everybody started to engage in that behavior, it would be a race to the bottom where everything would be fucked, right? So like a good rule for society would be no stealing, right? I think that's like without provocation.
Yeah, I mean, like, obviously as well, rule utilitarianism can obviously... I guess the thing is that what he's doing is he's taking his meta-ethic, quote unquote, which is I would say psychological egoism, and then he's applied that to his normative ethic, which is rule utilitarianism, and he's saying that to achieve this notion of goodness, this normative system will be the most applicable to achieve this notion of goodness, and he thinks rule utilitarianism. And he's actually doing the right thing there. He's actually being, at least seeing that there is a connection. You'll be surprised at how many people do not. There is a connection between meta-ethics and normative ethics, which is pretty much direct. What we describe as good or bad is in direct relation to the maximization of good and bad. Rule utilitarianism is about essentially what maximizes the utility, the overall consequences of positivity to every individual who is considered one. So we create rules which are ultimately in respect to these consequences. Rules themselves are dependent upon these consequences, and if the rule does not respect the consequences, then it should be cast out. So any given individual moral agent who is acting in such a way to respect a rule is only doing so in respect to the consequences which are actually trying to be maximized in the first place. The issue here is that when we look at rule utilitarianism, the individual is trying to understand the consequences separately, arguably separately from every other individual. So depending upon, we have to have a shared notion of what the goal and end is in the first place to maximize that goal and end. And that goal and end should be considered within each institution of society. And this is where you get things like threshold deontology and Hegelianism, which argue that in fact people should respect reasons and justifications within institutions, not try to reason themselves about the conclusion, because individualistic reasoning is incapable of being verified and falsified, and so is again typically biased. And so what is better than, I would argue, better than rule utilitarianism, even in respect to the consequences, is something like threshold deontology or Hegelianism, which is a combination of deontology and consequentialism in forms of institutions within our society. So we actually evaluate the reasons within our institutions, and they resolve themselves through our constant engagement in politics. And that's what politics is about. So I would like to see Destiny bring ethics and politics that close together, where you understand politics as really an aspect of ethics. But it seems that he's kind of going from ethics to politics, but what he needs to do is complete that hermeneutic circle and go back from politics to ethics. And it needs to be this understanding of the good life for man the good life for me is the good life for man. The good life for man is the good life that is X. X implies this in relation to my moral reasoning. My moral reasoning changes, and we have this circle which constantly perpetuates an improvement upon our moral system.
Okay. So you can make arguments for things like taxes or whatever later on, but yeah. How do you come up with the rules? Do you self-reflect, such does it come from yourself? So like a rule would just be anything that like I think would maximize like my personal happiness.
Well, that is terrible. Imagine that. Like, okay, a rule is anything that I think would maximize my personal happiness. You could be just deluded about that, for one. You could be absolutely wrong. You could be, there's a drug, for example, in a George Saunders book called Escape from Spiderhead, and the drug's called Darkenflox, right? It creates extreme depression, in which you become suicidal. You could just, like, and this isn't, like, that's science fiction, because you could just get suicidal. But you could just give someone this drug, and their moral reasoning and the rule that they're supposed to be following would be directly in relation to whatever they think is justified in that scenario. And the reality is that our reasoning is not unbiased. Our ability to think and understand scenarios is actually tied into this unbelievably emotive, subjective form. Not only do we not have perfect reasoning, but even if we did have quote unquote like objective reasoning, where we didn't really engage in our emotive states too much, just whether we're coming to right answers is a question that we need to ask. How many of us have done maths wrong, right? Like, you can do a maths equation like that. You have no reason to think that you are right in an equation. Like, if you do like something basic like 5 times 5 is 25, right? But then somebody comes along and goes, no, 5 times 5 is actually 30. And you outline your reasons, like you essentially do the working out. They outline the working out and you just talk through it, and that's why you end up with that, oh, no, my reasoning was flawed, I can see that kind of scenario. And unless you have that, unless you have some sort of mechanism which is going to question your capacity to actually see if your rules are right, you could be making rules about anything which could be absolutely absurd and not relate to this possibility of obtaining your own happiness. So no, whatever like rule you create should definitely not be solely dependent upon you.
So I'm being a little bit vague or vacuous with the term.
And just to clarify, there is even a separation in what is ontologically objective when he was talking about goodness, and what is epistemically objective in talking about judgment itself, right? So our ability to judge. Even my ability to judge my quote-unquote subjective system would still rely upon epistemics, upon logic, which is not subjective.
Personal happiness there, because what I'm assuming is the assumption that I without provocation means nothing if you don't define that term. So when I say like provocation, what I mean is like, is there a justification for doing an action that increases the net happiness in society? Is there a justification for performing a certain action that makes everybody better off if everybody like adheres to said action? So for instance, a form of theft that I think would be morally justifiable would be a thing like taxes, okay? So how are taxes justifiable? Because if I steal a little bit from the wealthiest people, the amount that they lose.
I like how he talks about taxation as theft, as if it's whether it's actually theft or not. Obviously, you could argue that within a social contract scenario that it's not theft, that you've actually agreed to it. But it is actually an argument that's presented by the right wing a lot. This idea that taxation is theft. This idea of, and it obviously is related to redistributionism. But in terms of politics, I think what actually, if you read some of the right wingers, for example, like Robert Nozick, I think that the right wing in that sense, like Nozick, who used to be left wing, by the way, guys, so take that into consideration, understands things a little bit better. The solution to the problem of a system isn't to create, ironically, exactly what Destiny's trying to avoid here, isn't to create an exception to the rule, right? You don't create an exception to the rule like, oh, well, we all earn unfair amounts, but we make society fairer by redistributing wealth via a tax system, right? Well, no, that's not actually solving the unfairness. What you're doing is treating a symptomatic production of unfairness with the medical taxation. You just like rip money from one person and put it in the hands of another. But then the taxation itself creates problems for small businesses, for a variety of other things, and the rule and the system itself isn't functioning properly. What works better is a proper distributionary system, where that people are earning a justified amount in relation to the amount of work that they do. And then, of course, you can have systems in place in which people have agreed to give, money to, welfare systems to prevent people from falling into harm and to prevent themselves from falling into harm. And even as Robert Nozick says, there are points of taxation which just make sense. So for society to function as the way it should, there comes to a point in which, unless you are willing to gamble to an extreme degree that you not only will be okay in yourself, but that society won't collapse, then you are forced to engage in forms of centralized justice and I would say centralized healthcare and so on. Otherwise, society won't be stable, and an unstable society doesn't allow you to achieve your means either. So you kind of do end up with this notion where I think you can avoid seeing taxation as theft, and you can have a minimized tax system and have a maximized distributionary system which actually responds to the amount of value an individual produces.
Lose, the impact on their life is going to be very little, but the net gain in happiness between everybody else in society is going to be very high. And also, when everybody else in society is super well off, your net gain in happiness is going to be higher off as well, right? Take, for example, a business owner in a city. If he's taxed and other people are taxed a little bit higher, everybody else in the city makes more money. That means that business owner has more people to sell products to. Less of his tax money is being wasted on like crime enforcement, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So theft would be a form of like justified thievery. How do you balance between social well-being and rights? I mean, I would argue that rights that exist, I think, would be an extension of things that contribute to your personal happiness. So, for instance, I have a right, generally,
So surely, I mean, like in this case, you basically say that a right, like you wouldn't believe in rights. Like utilitarians don't believe in rights. They just believe in rules which obviously reflect the scenario. Like when we talk about rights, what we're talking about then is just rules. Like, it's not that you have like an actual, like natural rights that are ontologically, objective and can be discovered, right? Because that would be a deontological point, right? That would be like maybe like Thomas Aquinas or someone, like natural law. That there are certain rules that we can observe that necessarily should be observed, right? That you are entitled to certain aspects of without the consequences. Like regardless of the consequences, if I have a right to liberty, regardless of my overall position within society, or overall, like for example, if I have a right to, like, let's say the vote, but my vote would be catastrophic to the consequences of general society, would the rule utilitarian think I should have a vote? No. The rule utilitarian would strip me of my vote. There is no natural right there. However, someone like Thomas Aquinas or like other deontologists would argue that the right itself is given to me by my nature and cannot be denied under any circumstances, regardless of the consequences.
A right to bodily autonomy. The reason being, I don't know if I could be happy in a society where other people have a right to use my body against my consent. Generally, I would say that like the function that rights serve is rights are kind of like a shield to protect you from other people fucking with you, right? Rights are something that basically serve to make it so other people can't come in and fuck with your internal happiness.
That's actually fairly consistent. That he's basically making rights rules.
Basically. So we have rules in society, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so do I want to talk about like tit for tat systems? No, I don't think so. If you engage with somebody or if you encounter somebody, okay, I think that all of a successful society is built on this type of exchange. If you find people that are not willing to engage with this type of exchange, then in my opinion, this is going to sound like extreme, but in my opinion, all bets are off.
So one thing I would say is that one, like when he says all bets are off, I'm assuming that this could devolve into what Thomas Hobbes and other natural law theorists call a state of war. The state of nature is a state of war. It's Thomas Hobbes. And from his meta ethic and then his normative application, I would actually assume that's basically where he's going with this. In which case, like, you don't follow the rules, you don't actually agree to the hierarchization of power. You don't give your power over to the state in order to dictate your behaviors in a certain way. Well, then you are overall an enemy of the state and need to be destroyed. This creates a really big problem for unfair power dynamics, for one. There is no justification, for example, for the state to not just annihilate someone who is just being exploited. So you're being absolutely exploited by the state because of your social class. Let's say you're a black person at the time of the Atlantic slave trade, and the social contract is going on. Everyone else, signs to their position. You sign to your position. You don't really want to. Like, you're kind of born into this class of slavery. Or even if you're a black person, even outside of slavery, let's take the time of the Jim Crow laws, right? You're being neglected by your society, right? But the rules are used to maximize happiness. The happiness is independent of isn't independent of a given individual. It's hierarchized within a system of, let's say, someone like Destiny's at the top and somebody else is at the bottom. You actively trying to not participate in the system because you see it as unfair. Let's say you try to revolt or try to argue for civil rights and so on. You should be actively crushed by the state within this moral system. I think that's kind of appalling. But like, I see what he's going for, and I don't think it's unreasonable in the sense that I think he's absolutely wrong, as I've said before about social contract theory. But in his application, he's absolutely right. This is kind of like where social contract theory ends up. Ultimately, he also is going to have a problem with engagement with other social contracts and other, what Thomas Hobbes calls leviathans, other states which have sovereigns or other states which have, governments which will ultimately create power systems which clash. Are we supposed to, for example, enslave other societies for our own gain because they're not signing our social contract? They have no desire to sign our social contract. All bets are off. Shall we go to war, destroy them, exploit them, and be the United States in Afghanistan? Or let's make proxy wars or whatever. Let's fund the Italian mafia. Whatever it is to gain like political value in this scenario. So the ultimate the ultimate thing that I'm going to say here is it's essentially going to create at least a justification to exploit other societies. Because if we treat other societies as having social contracts and individuals within them that won't sign ours, then all bets are off.
If somebody has proven that they're willing to drop this level of consideration, then I think it's fair to drop your level of consideration for that person as well. This is why I think that there are some people whose views are fundamentally incompatible with what I would consider a well-functioning society.
Well-functioning society. So you could be, China, and I could be the British Empire. You might want to make the trade essentially less exploitative. And I think that that's not absolutely okay. So I'm going to addict your entire population to opioids, and that is a functioning justified society, exploiting through this system another society for their own benefit of internal happiness and overall creating a scenario which benefits everyone in part of the social contract theory. So yeah, I don't know if he's going to get on to foreign politics, but hopefully.
For instance, a group of people that view themselves as racially superior to another people think that it's okay to take certain groups of people and excise them from society.
It's ironic because he's actually presenting a theory which would justify this kind of behavior. He just doesn't realize it.
Those groups of people won't be able to live in harmony with the other groups of people because they're trying to be eradicated, and it's going to cause like a lot of disharmony between these groups of people, right? So like highly intolerant groups of people or people that aren't willing to share this social contract with broad groups of people without valid justification. So for instance, if those other people aggressed on them first or whatever, would be people that I would consider like unable to reciprocate or be a part of like these types of societies.
What do we class as aggression? Do we class trying to seize property which was wrongfully taken as aggression? Do we class aggression as something direct, whether they are physically attacking you? Is economic warfare aggression, for example? At what point do we class aggression as being a breach of social contract, and what do we class as aggression is a question that I think he needs to answer.
So this is like a general rule, okay? General rule is that I need some reciprocated value here for me to want to reciprocate value with you. Reciprocated values, right? We'll just say that. None of these terms actually mean anything. You can say whatever the fuck you want. Okay. So if we have all of this set up, okay, one of the things that's guaranteed, okay, so we've moved through the meta level. This is the normative level. Now we're getting down to an applied level.
Yeah, he's been a good lad with that, to be fair. I'll give him his credit. Like, he's actually doing very well there. He's making sure things are, moving through very nicely, and I can definitely track where he's going, which is nice because most people can't track wherever I go, so...
Okay? If somebody were to talk to me about, like, let's say that I have my house, okay? Me feeling like I have a house, and me feeling like the security of that house is guaranteed to me by society... These are very, very, very important things to me, okay? I don't want to live in a society where it feels like anybody can take my shit or destroy my shit. I would consider that society dysfunctional, right? Because if we come back up here, like, what does it mean for me to be happy? Well, for me to be happy, I need to have certain things that are guaranteed to me. People aren't going to steal shit from me. People aren't going to fucking kill me. People aren't going to rape me. People aren't going to take my, these are things that, like, are important to me to maintain my happiness. This is like an agreement that I have with everybody else that lives, like, in my society, right? So if I'm in a society and somebody approaches me, okay, and this person is saying, hey, I'm going to destroy your shit, okay, in my view of morality, this person is not reciprocating to me a system that says that they're going to be respectful of the things that make me happy. As soon as a person has aggressed on me or aggressed on another person in that manner, where they're attacking this person's, like, internal happiness, where they're going...
But what if there's a rule which allows someone to do something which makes you unhappy? So there has to be a point in which this system is going to reduce your internal happiness for internal happiness simplicity, because you're thinking that it's everyone, or at least internal happiness in relation to the state. So what is the point in which your internal happiness is the justified limit from which your internal happiness can be breached? Is it the point in which it overall benefits you in relation to being in the state of nature, so anything which is better than the jungle? Or is it a certain, subjective level, in which case I feel okay? Because there could be a point in which you say that, the rules of this society are unjustified. I don't like the fact that, so for example, I'm not allowed to, shoot someone who trespasses upon my property, like they walk into my garden, they're a kid that kicks a football into my garden. They've destroyed my plant. I want to shoot that child. I'm very sad that I can't shoot that child. It's causing me psychological distress because I really like shooting children. Now, I need to change the rules of this society, and then you change the rules of the society, so it ultimately becomes that you can't shoot children who enter your garden. However, like in most social contract scenarios, we'd say that that is absolutely unjustified. There are points in which someone could trespass upon your property and not get shot. There are points in which someone could commit a crime against you, and then you ultimately, this is actually Robert Nozick, and you could ultimately have to compensate them later, right? And actually, John Locke says this first, right? Where he basically says, there are times in which you aren't allowed to take action yourself, and we should centralize justice so that you can ultimately claim, compensation at a later date. Now, what happens when you and the central justice system inherently come into conflict? Because there will be a point in which your quote-unquote subjective desires will conflict this system. The whole point of the central justice system in social contract theory is to essentially divorce you from being able to construct the rules independently, yet you always seem to relate it back to yourself and your notions of internal happiness. But your internal happiness isn't the only thing being maximized. Stop circling yourself, just start circling the whole social contract, because if you are not respecting the contract itself, everyone's happiness, then it has nothing to do with social contract theory. And what you're actually trying to do is, create essentially a pyramid scheme. And when you talk about, for example, this idea of like you or and your house, I hope that you mean everyone's houses, that you mean that there should be a rule which prevents individuals from causing harm, abstract harm to a given individual that exists within the social contract for the maximization of quote unquote internal happiness.
Against what this person like wants to get out of society in a way that's like a direct attack on their shit. I think that this person has a right to do whatever they need to stop this person from carrying out that aggression. Yeah. So this is basically where, in a highly abbreviated manner, this is where.
See, this idea of whatever he needs to. Like people like John Locke, for example, social contract theorist. People like Thomas Hobbes, social contract theorist. Pretty much every social contract theorist the argument is to centralize justice. That's the point. Like the reason that you enter the social contract is to prevent an individual from exercising their subjectivity over another, because essentially people are irrational. And, for example, I think John Locke gives the best example in which people try to engage with each other on property, or on punishment rather. Some person believes that when an individual commits a crime that they need punished more than they do. Then they do actually need punished. And some other person thinks that they need less. This can cause social tensions, which creates political instability, which ultimately forces the state of war. Now, the whole point of taking means which are which any means in which you can or are necessary, well, that's not the point. Like, what you need to do is protect the concept of home ownership, protect the concept of you having a house. Allowing someone to destroy your house, for example, someone comes in, absolutely wrecks my house. Okay, but I'm able to escape. I've gotten out of the house. I can be compensated for all that property at a later date from my society, from my central justice system, from the individual who committed the crime through, fines and so on. And ultimately, then he can be punished as well. The trespass can be resolved. However, if it was my life, if someone was trying to take my life, John Locke then says, like, I'm justified in using any means necessary to protect my life or the life of another, because that cannot be compensated at a later date.
Like, I build my model for self-defense. So if you're going to attack my shit, if you're going to come at me, okay, and then we can add a few more rules to make this more generally favorable for sex. So for instance, like, I should have some obligation to put this person on notice. Maybe in their internal happiness model, maybe property isn't that important to them. So they actually don't see this attack on me as that egregious. They wouldn't think that, like, oh, wow, I didn't know that was part of your contract.
See, I don't know if it's part of your contract, but I thought we were signing the same contract. The contract either is the objective contract, which we are all signing, or there isn't a contract. A contract isn't whatever I interpret it to be. Imagine if you had this in like any other thing, like, we both signed a contract in terms of employment. I know on the contract that it says that you would pay me, a fair wage, or you'd pay me for like $7 an hour, but like my understanding of $7 an hour and your understanding of $7 an hour, or my understanding of work done, or whatever it may be, is debatable. There are vague notions within the contract, and my interpretation of the contract is different to your interpretation of the contract. Actually, I have a separate contract here that we've both signed, like, each other's contracts, which are different things, even though we've not actually communicated that we were signing these contracts. And this contract says I'm getting paid $150 an hour, and your contract says I'm getting paid $7 an hour. My contract's right. That means it's nonsense, isn't it? We haven't signed a contract if it's not universally applicable. The contract has to be objective and within the state.
Right? So there should be some obligation to put this person on notice, like, hey, if you attack my house, I'm going to fucking kill you. Right? I think that you have that obligation to do that before taking action. Although I think in society, most people should reasonably understand that. And then there are other things that could augment this as well. So for instance, if this person is 4 years old, they probably don't have the cognizant, like, know-it-all, like, or wherewithal to know that they're breaking this contract. We wouldn't expect somebody.
Or there would be part of the contract. You could argue that someone who's mentally incapacitated, or someone who's too young, or for whatever reason they're incapable of actually signing the social contract. So you'd be like, well, then it's not that the social contract's not applicable. It's that you would say that they need someone to take responsibility for them.
Somebody that's 4 years old to be able to make that decision. If a person is like out of their mind on drugs or whatever, then arguably, if we consider them compromised, maybe killing them would be an ethical. I don't know. I'd have to think more about that one, because they're still threatening to destroy your stuff, and they're still engaging in an act that's leading to an action that threatening your mental happiness. But
then are you going to outlaw drugs because you can't control the consequences of someone's mental, like the reaction to substance abuse? Someone could take one drug and be absolutely fine. Someone could take a drug and go absolutely mental. There's no way to predict this, and there's no way for them necessarily to be able to predict this. So there comes to the point in which you would have to then create a rule, which is like, you can't do this drug, right? And if it's not, then you are saying there would also be risks. So if someone does, we allow drugs in our society. I want to take, like, for example, you mightn't, for your internal happiness, from when I've seen, I think I've seen very little of Destiny, but he did not seem to be too fond of drugs. So, but like, let's say he was a real big fan of drugs. Let's say he really wanted to take drugs, but then wanted to ban drugs for other people. Well, then arguably in some social contract scenarios, he could do so. But in the social contract scenario that he's trying to propose, he wouldn't be able to do that, right? In which case, you could say that he would have to accept certain risks in relation to what he considers his own internal, internal happiness, right? So then you'd have to basically weigh up the rules of the game against, quote unquote, his notion of internal happiness.
Yeah, it's kind of abbreviated, but I think that like this is basically where my argument for self-defense comes from.
Someone just said he's a huge fan of drugs. I don't know, man. I watched the thing that he was like, I don't know. He seemed to be really fan of hot chocolate in that stream. But then I don't watch very much Destiny, so you might know better than me.
Another person is not reciprocating with you the contract that we all agree to live by in society and has shown a disregard for things that make you happy. Therefore, I don't believe in any sort of objective morality or anything. I don't think you have an obligation to protect this person against their own harmful wishes. Their harmful wishes being to destroy your property and then endure any harm that might result from you defending your property. Oof, okay, there it is. Destiny, would you agree that killing a 4-year-old would be justified to save your livelihood if there was no other way, right? It's possible. So the way that I would explain this is that...
See, this is where you can end up basically creating notions for quote unquote of internal happiness. Like, how do you relate your internal happiness to the happiness of others? And he's saying that, for example, there is a time in which you could kill a 4-year-old, take someone's life to preserve for a fraction of your internal happiness. For example, your house. Your entire happiness might be based on your house. You might be compensated, have a house in the future, live a good life, blah blah blah. But take someone's life, end their interests absolutely. And so basically take their happiness in total from them. Now, that seems to me to directly show that the way he's applying his system is inconsistent, because he is saying that we are applying internal happiness in general, but it ultimately always relates to his notion, his own egoism, which is the bedrock of it. But the whole point of social contract theory is to say that egoism on an individualistic sense is incapable of satisfying one's actual desires, and so we need to create a social dynamic which is more capable of doing so. And so when he constantly relates it back to himself, he's actually denying social contract theory.
That if a 4-year-old was in a position to, so this is a little bit complicated, right? So I don't consider 4-year-olds to be moral agents, meaning I don't know if they could do something that I would truly consider to be right or wrong. Since they're not moral agents of their own, I would consider a 4-year-old, that is a human being, to be an extension of their parent, a form of property, basically. So if a 4-year-old is out causing significant harm to you and you have to kill that 4-year-old, I can't even imagine how this could be the case. But if that was the case, then the responsible party for that would be the parent of that 4-year-old, for letting them get into a place where they can act.
The only reasonable case for someone like, for example, John Locke would say that you are allowed to kill that kid would be, if they were threatening your life or the life of your child or something like that.
Actually cause that harm. So for instance, actually we can spin up an example.
So in this case, someone actually commented a really good point. Like, a 4-year-old is a slave to the parent in this scenario. Absolutely. And this isn't actually that like radical, right? Like ancient Rome, the father owned the children, for example. Like actually they were slaves to the father. So like it's not actually that radical in the grand scheme of things. However, and what we do typically think is that the parent will be a benevolent tyrant, but a tyrant nonetheless. And what the issue is in this is when he talks about the individual who's the dependent upon the adult who's responsible for them, and they're not a moral agent, and so they cannot sign the social contract, which means that they're actually morally inconsiderable in this scenario, which means that the parent can enslave them, literally have kids in order to enslave them till a certain age, until they're old enough to sign the social contract, and they could sexually abuse them, they could physically abuse them, whatever. Once they reach the age of social contract, then they could essentially kick them out and say, you know what, you're on your own, have fun, I'm not going to abuse you anymore. But there we go. Obviously social contract scenarios can create child protection laws and so on, but then they would have to give a justification which relates to something that is being respected other than the capacity to sign a social contract?
Example of this. This is a good question. So we spin up an example of this. What if I'm driving down the street and then a 4-year-old child starts crawling in front of the street, right? Out of nowhere, a fucking ninja 4-year-old starts crawling, or not crawling, I guess before, they start running out in the middle of the street, okay? Let's say that I can either swerve, and I swerve off the road, off a canyon, because I'm driving in Maui and Hawaii. I'll swerve off the road, and then I die. Or I have to run over the 4-year-old, right? Well, in that case, well, fuck it. I'm not going to suicide myself. You run over the 4-year-old, okay? You make the decision to kill the 4-year-old to save yourself from great personal harm. Maybe you and your whole family are riding around, right? If that's the case, I think that you're morally justified in killing the 4-year-old, but the responsibility for the death of the 4-year-old lies on the parent of the 4-year-old.
I mean, there is an aspect that, like, it was he's kind of placed it in that, like, no-win scenario, as, like, John Locke would say. I mean, that seems, like, kind of fair enough.
The parent was the responsible party of the 4-year-old. The 4-year-old can't make the decision to put your stuff at risk. The parent knows that the 4-year-old is capable of doing that. And by allowing the 4-year-old to roam, you know the risks of that happening in a given area. So you bear the responsibility of any action taken by that 4-year-old. So that would be like the chain of responsibility there, basically. Can you apply that logic to defending someone else's property? For sure. So let's say that I have a piece of property, and let's say that I feel like that.
Well, the thing is, when you're trying to defend someone else's property under a social contract theory, you do not defend individualistic property, as in it's not my property, therefore it's valuable. When you talk about defending you talk about defending the concept of property. That's essentially what we are talking about. That private property, the concept, must be defended.
Property is threatened by another person, okay? Another person is going to come and destroy my property. Let's say that they have 5 friends, okay? So let's say 6 people are coming to kill or destroy my property, right? If I know that I can't defend this property on my own, and I know that it's going to significantly curb my, internal happiness to lose said property, I think I should be able to reach out to society and say, like, hey, can you please help me defend my shit? To some extent, we already have this agreement with police officers, right? Hey, I can't defend my shit. I'm going to make an appeal to the public infrastructure. Can you please come and help me do it, right? In the case that a police officer isn't available, maybe you ask a friend. I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with that. I would expect that if somebody was threatening somebody else, it's okay to ask somebody else for help for it. If I was at a bar and a 6'9" dude came up to me and said he was going to fucking kill me, I would ask a friend for help. I wouldn't be expected to deal with that on my own. I don't think that burden should be placed on the victim of an aggressor. What if people don't follow your rules and that society's fucked, no matter what they do, they get shit on, aka civil disobedience, I don't think that civil disobedience contradicts my system in any way, size, shape, or form. I
absolutely do think civil disobedience absolutely contradicts his society. I mean, basically, like, if you look at it like something like Thomas Hobbes, for example, the notion of the sovereign, trying to revolt against the sovereign is a rejection of the social contract. And so what you are doing is creating a scenario in which someone tries to reject the power structures of society. They are ultimately in conflict with the social contract. The social contract needs to be respected for individualistic happiness. If individualistic happiness obviously is what matters to him in this respect because of his egoism, therefore civil disobedience needs to be crushed and the maximization of the sovereign power established. That's Thomas Hobbes. I mean, of course, you can have people like John Locke who come in and go, you know what, he was civilly disobedient. They were talking about executing the king. That was the whole thing. Let's get rid of the king and create a parliamentary system, which is democracy. And so the whole point was to be civil disobedience in that respect, like to make the contract in the first place. Now, the issue is like John Locke, for example, says that the legislator should be held to the legislation, and that the legislation should be in respect to all the individuals who are signing the contract. And I think John Locke gives a much better position than Hobbes, but ultimately because of Destiny's meta-ethical position, I think Thomas Hobbes would be more applicable here. I think that it's far easier to argue for a Hobbesian position of self-satisfaction and human nature being greedy than relying upon notions that Thomas Hobbes was relying upon of human nature not being self-satisfying and overarchingly trying to achieve one's own ends above everything else. And this notion of centralized justice, I think needs to be applied here. I will say that I think that he probably would want centralized justice, but then it's like, who is making the rules and at what extent do they apply to everyone? And overall, if the rules are democratically agreed upon and there is for example, you could have 50-60% of the individuals in society saying, yes, actually, I want this to occur, the tyranny of the majority. We wish to exploit this 30% class. Should they be civilly disobedient? No. But then I guess Locke would also argue that they should be respected in themselves, which would be, I think, a meta-ethical position which is incompatible with Destiny's. Yeah.
I'd be curious how. I think that people that live with different systems than me are generally incompatible with any reality that I would want to live in. I think that in general, most people have internal preferences that they try to satisfy, and that we ought.
I do not know what the hell happened there. But, I think me and him live in different systems. I don't really think that incompatible. But nevertheless, I think that even if you have incompatible systems, the whole point of this was to resolve our inherent incompatibility. That's the idea of social contract theory. So if someone has an incompatible system, they believe that child abuse is okay, responding to that with force is not necessarily the best option, because what you are trying to do, especially when the groups get larger and larger, when there are cultural differences and the differences in terms of social contracts conflicting each other, you're going to end up in a scenario which is basically going to force you into war unless it's otherwise resolved, which would be, creating maybe a meta-social contract, international law. But overall, I think there is nothing to appeal to here anyway. The largest social contract would end up just winning out.
Ought to be respectful of other people's.
They're basically going to fall into might makes right here. I think, at least in terms of international social contract interactions.
Internal preferences as well. If you have some moral system that makes it so that you can disregard the wills and wishes of other people in aggressive manners, then I would consider you to be, in every sense of the word, an immoral person. And immorality should either be purged or reformed, whatever is more likely, I guess. Destiny, shouldn't everyone more or less agree with all of this? Maybe, I don't know.
No, they really shouldn't. Okay. One, his meta-ethic is absolutely wrong. His understandings of internal happiness are dependent upon biased judgments. His understanding of self as a whole are also biased. His understanding of even the means to achieve happiness, again, bias, because it's psychologically egoistic. And then he relates that to creating a social contract and ad hoc ethics, which has come before that, as being able to create this social contract. So essentially, he takes biased judgments about himself and then forces himself into a social contract scenario because he believes that will be the best case scenario for him, even though his actual rationality at that point may very well be absolutely biased and open to the principle of explosion. So he could be, a religious devotee entering a theocracy, ultimately to self-sacrifice in the name of God, and that would be absolutely justified under this meta-ethical to normative relationship. And then his applied ethic, I think that he ultimately relates that back to his individualistic psychology rather than the social contract itself, which shows that there is a divide between even his normative ethic and his applied ethic, and then his normative ethic and his meta-ethic. I think that there is no reason to think that rule utilitarianism is actually the best scenario for maximizing his own well-being. So I don't think any of this works.
Do you think that defending random people's businesses with lethal force is justifiable, even though the person doesn't know whether it actually threatens their livelihood, like unrequested defensive businesses? I think that anybody that, in my opinion, anybody that thinks it's acceptable to walk around and cause massive destruction to other people's property is incompatible with like a healthy functioning society.
I don't think anyone would disagree with that for the most part. But then it depends. You could have a social contract scenario again, which, creates, or like, for example, a societal scenario in which the United States creates mass destruction of Iraq. They have a separate social contract. It's for the interests of everyone in one social contract at the detriment of another social contract. This is absolutely justified. And the incompatibility there is essentially the desires of one social contract over the desires of another. But none of this is essentially incompatible with what he's saying right now.
Not with private property. With public property, I can see other arguments for it, but not with private property, no. Unless they feel that that person has done like an individual wrong to them. So like if anybody wants to defend like anybody's random private property, I think that strangers could do it, and I think it would be morally justifiable. I don't wheel out this argument because it's obviously a more extreme take, and I'd have to walk through all this to get there, but I think that the concept of defending like private out of a pool,
I
or
think
if
the
you saw
stream
somebody's
might
car
have disconnected there, so I just paused the video. I think we're back, guys. I don't know what's going on there, but I hope it's ticking through okay. If it's just let us know in the chat. But I hope you're enjoying the stream, everyone. Yeah, if you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If you want to subscribe, please do consider subscribing. If you want to have a chance of winning my comprehensive introduction to Western philosophy, then join the Discord server and enter the raffle in the chat. And say raffle or enter me in the raffle section of the Discord. And if you want to donate and ask a question at the end, do not hesitate.
Are rolling down a hill, you could run and like try to apply the parking brake or whatever. That like everybody ought to be roped into defending everybody else's stuff. Protesting in a street would be justifiable in the system. Sure, of course you can protest if you want. Yeah. Is there anywhere your system breaks? No, I think if a system breaks, then it has to change. It's not a good system.
Well, like look at his internal happiness. For example, the internal happiness of him is dependent upon his social contract. Let's say that, and he agrees to that. But is it every social? But can he not go and sign another social contract? So he could leave. For example, he's got a considerable amount of wealth. Let's say the United States. I think he's American, isn't he? Let's say the United States goes to war. The United States goes to war, and ultimately he's in a great threat to losing his houses, his friends, his subs, etc. Right? So he ultimately has the opportunity to unsign from that social contract and go and sign to another social contract. Let's say the alternative side, and sell out and like betray his country, betray his social contract for his own individualistic, psychologically egoistic desires. Why wouldn't he do that according to his meta ethic? Why would he apply himself to this social contract? If anyone would like to answer that question for Destiny, please go right ahead.
I wouldn't think so, obviously, but yeah. Destiny, what happens when one person's internal preferences contradict somebody else's? A bad preference is one that demands other people to violate things that would satisfy their own preferences, in my opinion. There's like an incompatibility there. But I don't think I have any internal preference.
But then you could argue that all preferences are bad then, just to a varying degree, because we're all like, the whole point of the social contract theory is to reel in individual desires to create a scenario in which we all respect each other's preferences but limit our own preferences so that we don't trespass upon one another too much. But there is a constant limitation by the rule itself. So is a bad preference, like, in general, arguably the preference to follow that everyone should follow the rule would be a bad preference.
Preferences that contradict other people's so radically. Or if they do, I would argue that I'm correct and they're incorrect, and fuck them. So like basic.
You see that, then we'll go. Then the social contract is essentially like a constitution written by destiny.
Like I have an internal preference, for instance, for taxation in society because I believe government provides goods that dramatically increase the well-being of all its citizens. There might be other people in a society that feel like, oh, well, I totally disagree with taxes. Taxing me is thievery for me. Well, I would say, okay, well, you're incompatible with my society. So I either have to make you bend to my will using force. So we do that with police, for instance. Like you have to pay your taxes or you get arrested.
I mean, you couldn't just let them make another society. I mean, like, arguably, like, if someone is... The idea is like they must bend to my will and pay taxes, not necessarily taxes or death, not necessarily, allow them to, politically be extricated from the system, go and sign another social contract and be separate.
Or we kick you out of society, or we go.
Oh, there we go. Actually, that's fair enough.
Separate. It's connected because social contract is the benefit of feeling intuitively valid. However, the application of the system in regards to how people actually feel isn't distinct. Some people feel fucked, thus some protesters and rare, some rioting against the system's sure system. I just don't think that in any moral system, I don't think rioting against private property can be okay. I think rioting against public property can be justified pretty easily.
Well, what if the scenario was to privatize all property? Like you live in a society in which you're arguing for a society which has a somewhat decent amount of public property, but then in reality, let's say the Occupy movement is arguably a protest which causes harm to businesses and so on. The only separation from that and rioting is perhaps the individuals on the scene, right? But if we're talking about notions of private property, you're not justifying it in the sense of individual harm. You're talking about the property itself. So I can cause someone to lose property without rioting. So I could have like the Occupy movement, for example, Occupy Wall Street or something like that. People lose property. Are they justified in doing so because it damages the notion of private property? I make someone lose money, they lose property, they ultimately face harm in the social contract. Should I be dispersed by the police? Should Martin Luther King have been dispersed by the police?
But So would you not just be a hedonist or utilitarian? I don't know. I'm not trying to label the words or whatever. There's like other, we could talk about like egotistical, psychological egoism or ethical egoism. I don't care about that shit. I'm not, it's just like really basic. We can do this without using any big meme words. Can you define a period that caused mutual respect for property, such happiness to fail in our current societal system? I mean, so arguably, if we take this broad concept of self-defense, right? What does self-defense mean? Self-defense means that somebody is aggressing on you in a way that makes it so that you can't satisfy your internal happiness, right? What we could talk about the black community at large, okay? So
I'm glad he's kind of getting onto this, because like obviously talk about reparations. The Native Americans are actually a great one, because a lot of arguably they have a historic claim to the entirety of the United States. And even the exploitation of their ancestors was so great that there is a notion in which their private property was obviously damaged a considerable time ago. So yeah, like we need to talk about like whether they have a justification to retrieve arguably their property. This is something which socialists talk about a lot of the time, that unjustified claims towards property can be then justifiably removed. So if someone has come in as a colonial, for example, and claimed a vast amount of the land unjustifiably, they do not have justified claims to that land. So he's going to have to reconcile that as well.
The black community has a feeling that the United States as a whole is aggressing on them in a way that's preventing them from satisfying this internal happiness. So what...
actually, guys, I'm going to quickly go to the bathroom because I'm going to blow up. So, I'm going to put some nice music on for you guys, and I'm going to go to the bathroom. I hope you're enjoying the stream. Let us know. Like, are you enjoying the stream? Also, somebody asked a question there. Wasn't Martin Luther King against rioting? Martin Luther King was absolutely against rioting. Martin Luther King was against violence as a whole. Actually, really great guy. The difference, I suppose, of what I'm saying there is that he was relating it to private property. When we talk about rioting, I don't think he's got a problem with rioting itself. Like if you're rioting in public property, it's not the rioting. The problem is the private property. And the problem isn't the harm that it could do to another individual. Again, it's to do with the private property. So if you could do actions that would cause a damage to private property without rioting, then ultimately he would have to say the exact same thing, that it would be justifiable to use police force to disperse you. But yeah, I am going to be right back, guys. How to break your stream, guys. Jesus. I hope you're all doing okay. Is everything going okay since I went down? Oh, really good breakdown so far. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. And thank you, Chris, for being here as a mod. Really appreciate it. If you like this content, please consider subscribing. And yeah, let's get back into it.
Whether that's the perpetuation of systemic racism in forms of like criminal justice system, in forms of poor funding for schools, in forms of redlining and gentrification that's pushed on homes, right? Black people might have this feeling. If that's the case, then black people are morally justified in protesting or fighting against this system. Black people would have an argument there. And since earlier I said it's totally fair for us to defend other people who feel like they're being aggressed on, because we would want other people to defend us if we're feeling aggressed on, I would expect non-black people as well to be able to join those black people in terms of protesting what they perceive to be aggressions towards whatever's satisfying their internal happiness. It's like where the justification for protest would come from. Protests are not...
This idea of like internal happiness and overall, like at what point does the group become large enough to say that it justifies them taking action against the state, right? Like, could the group be, would the group be justified in taking action against the state if it was so small, if it was smaller? At what point does it become like justifiable? If it's the point of just basic internal happiness, he even said himself that there comes to a point in which an individual is, has a different conception of happiness to himself, then it's justifiable to, crush that individual and make them sign the social contract or kick them out, right? So the only reason that he's actually engaging with the black community here isn't a notion of justice, it's a notion of power, that he's actually scared of the political instability that engaging with black people will be causing. So what is the grounding here for allowing black people to be, politically aggressive against the social contract? Is it the fact that they have enough power that you would rather that they didn't commit such violence? Or is it that there is a genuine injustice going on and overall it's showing an issue with the social contract? Bloody hell.
So in my worldview, a protest is not a form of aggression. A protest is a form of self-defense against somebody else's aggression, is how I would view it. I think there's a difference between law enforcement defending someone.
Well, it depends, right? You could have a protest, which was, arguably the what's it called? The KKK are protesters. They're just protesting the existence of black people within the social contract, right? So, like, protest doesn't necessarily have to be, a notion of self-defense against the state. Like, that's just not how that works. Protesting can be self-defense against the state, or protests can be saying that, actually, the state isn't matching my means of internal happiness. I wish to have more legislative power, and therefore I am protesting to increase political instability so that I can increase my class's likelihood of having political control over the rules that we have defined as the limitations of social justice, right? And in which case, we're in a power dynamic with individuals who are constantly protesting in terms of quote-unquote self-defense, when in reality it's actually the expression of their own desires, because that's what all of us are doing. And in which case, then everyone's justified to protest at any point in time, so long as they have the power and the means to do so, so that essentially might makes right.
Someone's property and random people defending people's property without being asked to. I think the latter is reckless and is more likely to lead to people getting hurt or killed. So we can talk about like the actual application of somebody defending property, because that could be done imperfectly. However, that's not really the moral argument. That's more like that would be more like a practical argument. In a practical manner, strangers defending other people's property could be so imperfect that it's hard to morally justify it. That could be true. But however, you can also kind of sort of make an argument against even calling the police for this. So for instance, some people would argue that it's not fair to deport somebody because they're stealing from a store. So therefore, it could be immoral to call the police on robbers because they might be illegal immigrants and they'll get deported if they get caught, right? So or maybe somebody's breaking into your place. Well, I could go handle this myself, but if I call the cops might kill the person, right? So you could technically make that argument anywhere if the practical application is low enough. I guess it's up to an individual to feel like if the practical application of their belief can be done in a way that's morally responsible.
Obviously in every system, whatever it may be, is dependent upon individualistic judgment at some point. But when we are dependent upon individualistic judgment terms of applying the rules, which are genuinely seen as preventing, greater over catastrophic harm, there comes to a point which we may just be putting everything in the hands of the individual anyway. So why is it rule utilitarianism and not act utilitarianism? So at what point should they be applying the rule? It's not always no. Okay, so what are the given exceptions? Why is this an exception and why isn't something else an exception? And if it overall relates to is it the ability to respect the consequences, the overall consequences of everyone's happiness, or is it individualistic, which you keep bringing it back to?
So, for instance, if you were like an ex-cop, or you've got a lot of like training with your firearms, and you feel like you can handle yourself responsibly, maybe you're a bouncer, bodyguard, whatever, and you want to go and defend a piece of property, then like you're probably okay to do so. Right? That's up to you to figure that out. Destiny, do you think anyone actually disagrees with what you laid out here? I feel like lefties are just being...
Absolutely, and it's not because I'm left wing. The reason I'm disagreeing, I mean, none of this has anything. I mean, you could be right wing and disagree with all of this. You could basically say like, one, he's understanding of metaethics, he's understanding of his normative application, he's applied ethics as a whole. Like, you don't have to be left wing to argue against any of this. No, I could be like, you could be like a libertarian socialist, and you could be definitely arguing against this. And not a libertarian socialist, that's actually me. A libertarian connected right now. Hopefully I am. Yeah.
Partisan of their side. I don't know. I'm just laying it out just so people can see, I guess. Haven't you said before that you think vigilantism is stupid? Would any form of going out of your way to defend someone else be vigilantism? Okay, so I know this sounds like a meaningless distinction, but when I say something is stupid, that's way fucking different than saying something can be morally justified.
So vigilantism is usually condemned in social contract theory as being irrational, right? By John Locke, for example, and by Thomas Hobbes. The whole point of it is to give one's moral authority over to the state so that they can make the decisions in relation to justice. That's why we have things like police forces, so that people don't go off and decide how people should be punished and how they should and should not behave, right? So ultimately, like, you're divorcing individual subjective decision-making processes away from the moral quandary, the ethical dilemma, unless, as far as humanly possible. Now, he's throughout this whole thing not done that. Like, it's not been like, in every scenario we should call the police, we should check legislation, we should ultimately engage in a form of civil discourse. No, it's always been direct intervention on behalf of the individual in relation to protecting their property. This is actually far more. This is almost like, it's funny because it's almost as if you're not part of a social contract. It's so strange. At least that's how I'm interpreting it anyway.
Okay, if somebody punches you in the face, okay, at a bar, I think you could be morally justified in punching them back if you wanted to. But I think it's stupid because the threat that you're increasing the likely threat to yourself, you're not going to de-escalate the situation. You could represent greater potential harm in the future. I think it's really dumb. But I think you have justification to do it. If you're,
dependent upon like the scenario, I'm assuming.
Really want to. I'm not going to say like, dude, I'm not going to say like that was wrong of you to do. What I might say instead is that was stupid of you to do. Right? I think those are meaningfully different things. If protesting is self-defense and lethal force is justified in self-defense, couldn't you justify rioting? Well, I think that as part of self-defense, we should probably take like the minimum level of force necessary to convince the other party that what they're making is a mistake, right? Basically, that if somebody is infringing on your internal happiness, that doesn't give you carte blanche to instantly kill them, but you use escalating measures to stop them from doing something so that...
Someone is infringing on your internal happiness, no, someone is infringing upon the social contract. Otherwise, your notion of internal happiness is actually the social contract, in which case you are the master in a master-slave relationship, enslaving the entirety of the population towards your will. Like, no, you have to relate it again back to the concept of internal happiness for the contractarian scenario.
Rather than killing him instantly. So, for instance, if protests are a form of self-defense against an aggressive government, well, then you slowly escalate the protests until, I mean, like in some cases, maybe a protest gets the job done. If it doesn't, maybe rioting. If it doesn't, then maybe fucking civil war. Like, If there was a strong threat of protest evolving into rioting and looting, wouldn't the police be justified in preemptively shutting them down according to your system? It's possible.
No, the police would be absolutely justified in shutting anything down which was a threat to the social contract and the social fabric, right? So if there is a class of individuals who are complaining about their place within the social contract and their place in the hierarchy, let's say they feel that they've been exploited, but the central justice system has ruled that they haven't been exploited. Or we have determined that their exploitation doesn't matter as much, whatever it may be, in terms of our internal happiness and our relationship with each other, then overall, then the police would be not only justified but arguably obligated in this scenario to shut them down, to maintain political stability, to benefit the social fabric of society.
Like, if you thought that there was such an extreme level of harm that would be disproportionate in counter to the other harm being committed.
I'm just going to point this out. Like, I will say that kudos to Destiny for trying to do this, because it is not easy, guys, to create a meta-normative and applied ethical relationship that actually respects the greatest amount of good as a whole, like the greatest amount of like right and justice, right? I think that his scenario is and what is actually logically valid and sound, right? So he's doing his best. I don't think he's hit the nail on the head. I don't think he's done the best job at actually providing a system which is correct. But I do appreciate the effort here, and I think he's doing better than most people would do. Like, way better than most people would do. Like, 100 times better than most people would do.
So if the defenders were preparing to enact an extreme form of harm in response to what a perceived aggression, I think you could preemptively shut down defenders. Sure. So if I were to think of a small example of this, let's say that somebody at a bar is walking up to somebody and they're kind of drunk and they want to punch this dude. Okay? I'm drunk and I'm going to punch you because you're black and I hate you. Okay? All right. And the black guy sees the dude and he's like, oh, okay. Now, I think that the black guy could be morally justified in punching him back, okay? I'm just using black guys. Maybe the guy's racist, but whatever. The guy could be justified in punching him back, but what if I see that the other guy has a knife in his back pocket and he reaches to pull that knife out, right? I think that you could run up to the guy that's holding the knife and knock him out, okay? Even though he technically hasn't done anything wrong yet, but like if you perceive that he's about to respond to an aggressor with an insanely disproportionate level of force, like...
Yeah, I mean, there comes to a point in which we say that there is a limited amount of like threat that an individual can be expected to deal with. So like someone could be taking a threatening pose, and someone, you know, putting a hand towards a firearm would say that the police, most of the Americans I think agree that once an individual puts a hand upon a firearm when they're talking to the police, as looking like they're going to like reach and shoot them, and the police can take action, they are justified in taking action to prevent the individual from, shooting them. But it's at what level of action they're allowed to take, and it's also, and they should all be defined within the limits of the social contract and not down to individual subjectivity as much as humanly possible.
More than he needs to shut down the aggression, then I think that you could preemptively take actions against him. Sure. So protesting is valid if you've got like good reason to believe that protests could turn massively fucking violent and cause a disproportionate amount of damage in relation to what they're protesting. Then I think that you could be justified in shutting that down beforehand. Yes. This is often done in Europe when police hear that football hooligans join protests and there is a large chance of riots. They forbid the protests. Sure. Destiny, is an individual morally justified in defending all the property they own, or are they only morally justified in their property is necessary for their survival? The former statement is true. Where would the line be drawn as to when? I think that all private property is defensible. I don't want to live in a society, okay? I don't
want to live in a society. Destiny 2020. No. All private property is defensible. Okay, but what about private property which is unjustly acquired, or private property which exists primarily in the hands of an individual who is going to cause a disproportionate amount of harm to the overall society, which is apparently what the social contracts, respecting, in which case you argue for something like tax. So it seems to be that like all private property should be respected is wrong here, even against what he said before. What he means is that private property should be respected to the greatest degree until it contradicts the overall consequences, and then we reject private property once again. If he tries to uphold private property past the point of social benefit, then ultimately it's going to crumble again, and his notion of social contract theory will fall out under his feet, in which case he's going to be rejecting the concept of rule utilitarianism, rather. He's going to be rejecting his rule utilitarianism, his normative ethic. If he's, on the other hand, saying that private property ultimately should be respected so long as it's beneficial for the overall of society, then he's actually being fair enough. But then if you were to make a socialist position and say that actually the demolition of private property could benefit the overall society, or let's say the removal of the top 0.1% or the 1%, removing their private property would be justified under a certain regime for greater overall happiness, then his system should say remove their property, not respect it.
I want to live in a society where my shit can be fucking destroyed and I have no way to stop it. That would be like an important part for my internal happiness. If I want to be able to defend my stuff from a would-be aggressor, I ought to have the right to do that. Morality is more complicated than internal happiness. I disagree.
Yeah, kind of. I mean, what I would say is more complicated is the notion of internal happiness. Actually, I don't think that. I think that happiness, for example, has been a question in ethics for a long time. What is happiness? So when we talk about like morality being more complex than a notion of internal happiness, it's not that morality necessarily is more complex than a notion of internal happiness. It's that the notion of internal happiness is more complex than this. I mean, like, even in terms of an individual's ability to understand themselves, many people don't understand themselves. And this, I mean, if people did just understand themselves, there would be no reason that any of us should ever get therapy. Like, the whole point of therapy is to say, like, look, you do not understand your thought processes and what's allowing you to come to these conclusions, and the behaviors in which you're enacting are ultimately self-destructive. So go to a therapist so that you can analyze your thoughts and behaviors to come to conclusions which allow you to modify them and live a happier life. That all depends upon you being unable to understand yourself implicitly or without help from another. And I think all of us pretty much agree with that. And so, like, ultimately that alone, like, Hegelian Lacanian understanding of the individual and their desires and the system of drives ultimately contradicts his understanding of internal happiness, which he is using to create this kind of social contract theory. You don't need the social contract theory because ethics is prior to it. You're actually ad hocing social contract theory as an explanation for ethics when it's dependent upon ethics itself.
I will wholly argue and stay mad. All of metaethics is fucking trash, garbage.
No, man. Like maybe like a lot of metaethics is trash. Like I could agree with that. Like there is a lot of terrible metaethics, but not all of it.
Waste of time. It's philosophers that are bored as fuck circle jerking against other philosophers that are
Nah, man. Like the reality is I think that he's probably just read broad metaethics. Probably read a lot of analytic philosophy in which they're arguing very much about definitions and applications of those definitions and not very much grounding it in human experience. Metaethics really should never be divorced away from ethics as a whole, from normative ethics or applied ethics. And the question of metaethics is vitally important to understand whether we're even using normative systems correctly, and whether we're actually talking about the same thing when we're talking about applied scenarios. Like when I say something like rape is wrong, my understanding of the word wrong is dependent upon the grounding for what is ethics. Okay, so no, like you can't just be like, oh, metaethics is trash, we can just like avoid it. The reason that you didn't avoid it in this discussion is essentially because it's necessary. Do I think that a lot of metaethics in the literature is kind of terrible? Yeah, like non-cognitivism exists, guys. Like I mean, come on. Like we're like half of the internet and half of society as a whole, in the words of Alistair McIntyre, is enacting philosophy that's over 100 years old, right? Like they're 100 years behind, let's say, academic philosophy. And so if you look at, like, for example, current ethics professors, like 70% of them are objectivists. And that's not an accident. That's because they read the literature. That's because they read a lot of the arguments that are being presented, and they come to conclusions which aren't absolutely ridiculous. But a lot of the literature still is terrible. Like objective ethics or, subjective ethics, a lot of it's terrible. A lot of them are using systems like non-naturalism, which I don't agree with, for objective ethics. Not that they're necessarily bad, but a lot of them I don't agree with. And then like non-cognitivism, quasi-realism, like various other systems which I think are ad hocing notions of an understanding of self, like for example, like quasi-realism or subjectivism, and then non-cognitivism, which I think is a positive case for ethics, which is yet to assert itself above an objective case, and the negative case against ethics is even more terrible. That being said, I think that there are a lot of really good moral anti-realist philosophers. Like, I do appreciate a bit of Nietzsche now and again. I disagree with most of what he says, but I do appreciate a lot of his arguments. I do appreciate the works of very many anti-realists, but then I think a lot of them again are trash. So yeah, I get what he's saying, but it's kind of like hit and miss, man. It's not like straight up like this philosophy is terrible, this philosophy is good. Absolutely not.
That are bored as.
I mean, if you want to see absolute trash, you can see a lot of that in political philosophy. Like, a lot of that in political philosophy.
Fuck, because they're just out of circle. Fuck everything about meta-ethics and figure out what is actually good bullshit. All of us have things in life that we want. We try to satisfy those wants. That's all morality is, okay? So everybody who disagrees, suck a dick. Were the militia in the Kenosha case generally defending property, or were they counter-protesters attempting to intimidate a combination of protesters and rioters? I mean, that's a question that seems hard to answer. However, based on the videos that I've seen, okay, like what I think is really important is to look at the order of aggression, okay? So in Kenosha, my understanding is that one, there was a curfew, okay? So if we're out past curfew, now we have one level of aggression from the protesters that has already put the other side on the defense, right? Because if you're violating curfew, there could be reasons why. Now, maybe they're just there to continue to protest, in which case, oh, fuck it, curfew is fine. However, if they're violating curfew and they start to show that they have the likelihood or the proclivity to start to destroy property, well, then they're continuing to up the level of aggression. If this is true, then people that are there for the express purpose of defending property, like, I think that by virtue of having guns out, you've put the other side on notice. Like, hey, you start fucking shit up, like, we've got guns, like, don't do it or whatever. As long as they're making like reasonable efforts to maintain their position and not like also aggress. Although at that point, it's hard to say that the people with the guns there are aggressive.
I mean, there comes to a point where it's like, why is it like, I mean, like, can we not just talk about, like, if we're talking about the American political system, why is it always guns, man? Like, you can disperse a crowd without using like deadly weapons, right? Like, it can't actually occur, believe it or not, right? It, like, you know, like, I know that like water cannons and like gas canisters and stuff like that are ultimately possibly capable of killing people and causing severe damage, but it seems to me that there is always this like straight up like bang, let's just shoot people. And this is one of the biggest problems with the United States. If you look at the way the police work in the United States, they have no legislation that forces them to take other means before pulling a gun. So like, they don't, like, in a scenario have to pull a taser first, or in a scenario mace them, or in a scenario use every other means possible to prevent the individual coming to doing damage, right? They can just go straight to deadly force. If you implement what has been shown, if you implement from the data I've seen, if you implement using other means to before having to take deadly force, you can cut police killings in half. And this has been run, I think, at a few police departments in the United States. And if you made that national legislation, that's something that like Black Lives Matter should be actually advocating for. Unfortunately, Black Lives Matter is a basically headless movement with no genuine end goal. It says it wants to end the harm being done to black people from the police, even though it's not actually promoting any given legislation. So there is a lack of leadership and a lack of goals there, and I think that needs to be resolved. And I think something like promoting legislation which ultimately holds the police accountable for their actions to a greater degree would be how to do it.
Aggressing more when the protesters are already out past curfew and still contributing to destruction of property. What if you got a bunch of white supremacists to defend your property against BLM protests and are black people? Wouldn't this practical application do more harm than good if these people have a motivation to harm more people? It doesn't really matter who's defending. I'll drop my hot take because I don't really give a fuck. It doesn't matter if it's Nazis or white nationalists or whoever defending your property. Much the same that for BLM, it doesn't matter if it's like black nationalists or Nation of Islam that are protesting, right? We have to look at the individual actions that these people are taking. Just because you might be a bad person or just because you might have some bad moral beliefs doesn't mean that every action you take, therefore, past that has become bad. That's not how we determine whether an action is good or bad. A bad person can do neutral or good things. A good person can do neutral or bad things. If like a bunch of white nationalists or black nationalists or whatever show up to defend a piece of property or whatever, then as long as they're not engaging in aggressive behavior or aggressing on another side, they have the right to do that.
I will say this: this is one of the problems with utilitarianism as a whole: the divorce between the individual intention and the consequences. An individual trying to, commit a harm, which ultimately does respects the rule, is not immoral, not unethical in a utilitarian sense. That they've not done anything wrong, even though, let's say, like someone like attempting to commit murder that does not actually manage to commit it, they've not actually done anything wrong. The point of the matter is that intention is of value. Intention matters, and ultimately the whole point of rule utilitarianism in many regards is to say that, you know what, we need to actually kind of reel people in and make sure that they're following certain rules, that they're intending to create certain consequences, right? And overall, I think this is where kind of utilitarianism itself fails and consequentialism itself fails. It lacks the point in which human intention actually relates to outcome. The whole point of moral reasoning in the first place is to say that if I have a certain intention, then I should act a certain way to achieve a certain outcome. And what intention I have relates to overall, should relate to the outcome, should relate to my desires, should be related to what will actually bring around the greatest good, the greatest expression of right? So overall, I should act in the most reasonable, justified way in order to bring around the greatest overall happiness, if you're a moral objectivist like myself, right? And so what I would say is that that's not rule utilitarianism. That rule utilitarianism would tell you to act, wouldn't condemn someone for a certain intention, when I would say that you should monitor your intentions if you are attempting to bring around the greatest overall good. And ultimately should be trying to respect a certain rule, because rules themselves have embedded reasonings, and that's why you end up with something like rule utilitarianism to try and overcome the problems of consequentialism or act utilitarianism. Also, guys, if you're enjoying the stream, please like.
What should someone do if guns are illegal except your own house in his country and there were the same riots happening in the city? I don't know. It depends if you have the... I don't know. That gets more complicated. I mean, it depends on how you get a gun and everything. Yeah. Destiny, the gun people are out past curfew, so the curfew is a wash. No, that is not true. The gun people are only out past curfew because of the aggression of the protesters out past curfew. If the protesters leave, the gun people leave as well. So no. That is not true. The curfew and the violation of curfew would be on the protesters. To be clear, protesters being out past curfew alone does not make them rioters or destruction of property people, or whatever. Like, yeah, with a militia defending. Okay,
but why? Like, let's just say, like, if the curfew is being put forward by the central justice, from which is the apparent moral authority of the state, then, and it's trying to respect the overall good consequences of the state, then why can't I make people conform to the curfew if it's likely to create people who, make the scenario like the best for everyone? Should they not be actively attacked by the state, held accountable for their actions? Should use of force not be taken? So I think, I think ultimately, Destiny's not using his normative ethic to the applied situation correctly. But, I think we can... I'll not try and reiterate that point over and over again.
Okay. Well, you're saying express purpose of defending property, but my question was, were they actually defending property? Was that their genuine purpose? Contrasting with the Korean stop the shops unapproachable, tourists genuinely defending property with their weapons. Here we have a kid getting separated from a militia, running around a riot with a gun on their back. It doesn't look to me like a group of people sitting on the top of... You're trying to get into people's minds in ways that I can't. If we want to look at the particular situation, we've gone from all of this here is deductive. So when I say deductive, when I say that something is deductive,
it's trying to be deductively valid. I don't think that he's actually being deductively valid. I do think, I think throughout the stream I've pointed out some inconsistencies. But whether it's sound or not, I absolutely think that none of it's sound. I think that he's ad hoc'd a really big justification at the beginning with, one, the meta-ethic, and then two, in its ability to be expressed in terms of social contract theory.
An example of a deductive thing might be all men are mortal, okay, is our first proposition. Socrates is a man, okay, second proposition. If Socrates is a man and all men are mortal, Socrates is mortal. That's our conclusion, okay? When I say something is deductive, that means that by virtue of the logic in the argument, it is true, period, full stop, right? Now, if we're trying to figure out why was Kyle in any given area, we've moved away from the realm of the deductive, and now we've got to go into the inductive.
But, like, you're saying that it's true, but then this is all subjectivism, isn't it? That's what he said. Like, he thinks that he doesn't think that it's psychological egoism and it's objective. He thinks that it's subjective, which means that it's actually not truth apt in an objective way. So it can't be true. It's valid, but not sound. At least in terms of being actually having the capacity for being like truth apt. I mean, like in an objective realist sense. It can be truth apt against, for example, his own psychology, like whether this is actually true against, his, fundamental axioms, as like the presuppos call it, like quasi-realism, like Simon Blackburn, or like emotive normativism, like not Stephen Luke's, that's Power, like Stevenson. But overall, again, overall, that is assuming truth relates primarily only to the subject. And then this whole social contract thing, when he's saying that this is true, it's true for destiny. That would be the only thing that he could say, even if it was valid and consistent, and which would then say that it was sound. In this sort of subjectivist case, it would only be true for destiny.
Inductive, right? So inductive might be, I walk into a room, a person is holding a smoking gun, and another person is laying on the floor shot. Inductively, it seems as though this person has shot the person laying on the ground. I don't know that. That's not 100% true. That's not logically 100% true. That's an inductive argument. So
induction, and the best way to understand induction is conclusion and then the premises. So like assuming a conclusion, then trying to prove it with evidence. A deductive argument is, taking the evidence and then trying to make a conclusion that fits. So if you have a conclusion in mind and then try to make the evidence fit it, like clearly the guy shot like the man in the room because it's the only man in the room with a gun. Like, you are being inductive. If you are trying to be deductive, you say like, okay, are there any other means from which this person could have gotten shot? What is the evidence and the likelihood of somebody else being in the room and being able to shoot him, and so on? And that would be a deductive argument in which you come to the conclusion of how the individual got shot. Like, could he have shot himself? Like, could the gun have accidentally discharged or something like that?
Why was Kyle at any given place? Well, when we speak to the intentions of any person, we almost always did inductive. That's not to say that inductive is shit or whatever, but like it seems to be the case that Kyle wasn't there to murder people, and we can inductively argue like, well, why do we believe that? How were his actions? Did his actions seem like he was more as a murderer or as like a protester, anti-protester, whatever? Like we have to go into that, but yeah. The problem here is you're advocating for the unbalanced power structure of the curfew. More or less, it sounds like you're saying people just need to follow the curfew and be controlled, which is the whole point of the protests. Wrong. I reject that. So one, I am saying that people need to be controlled. Nobody disagrees with that. Some level of control is good. We don't want a whole city descending into chaos or mayhem. Number one. Okay. Number two, the whole point of the protest is not to break curfew. The point of the protest is to put the police on notice that shit is fucked. And
well, I mean, the argument is that if the curfew is to go against an unjustified state and the social contract has fell into crisis, then the curfew may be unjustified because the social contract is what is prescribing this behavior in relation to an unjustified relationship between individuals, in which case you could reject the curfew as through means of trying to achieve the foundations, quote unquote, of the social contract. So necessarily you could argue that the social contract, the rejection of the social contract central justice in the first place is directly a rejection of the curfew and the ability of them to tell you what is justified and not. It's fell into crisis. Not necessarily, but yeah, I think that's an argument that could be made.
And to gather support across the country and to raise awareness about, fucked up issues related to police departments. That doesn't require you to riot. You don't need to riot to be a protester. You also need...
But then there is a point in protest, which is the point of protest is effectiveness. Right. And if you follow all of the rules that the social contract kind of puts in place, then your ability to have social change is going to be heavily limited because the social contract in this scenario is trying to self-preservate. It's trying to preserve itself and political instability. If it can do that by limiting social like taking social action against the social contract, then it's self-preserving by essentially preventing the effectiveness of the protest. So if the protest has a goal, which is to change the social contract, and the goal of the social contract is to prevent change to the social contract, or, create political stability by preventing change to the social contract, or preventing the social contract from having to be rewritten, and so on, then overall there is a confliction of interests which forces the social contract to have to be rejected by the individuals who are protesting. So saying someone who is directly protesting the state and its ability for power should follow every rule that the state puts forward, then no. But then you can arguably put that there is a limitation of this, right? Like, someone may not have to, in all cases, reject the curfew. But then I think the protesters are directly arguing, at least I would expect the protesters to be arguing, that the curfew is inhibiting their possibility of social change.
Don't need to be out past curfew to be a protester. Most bad things with these protests are generally happening past curfew. You can protest just as well in the morning. Don't you think having a bunch of metal folding door to protect their livelihoods could have stopped a lot of looting? Maybe, but I don't know if it should be an obligation of a person. Just because you don't have the particular piece of defensive infrastructure doesn't give another person the right to loot your stuff. Would you extend this justification of self-defense to everywhere internationally, regardless of each country's stance on guns, etc.?
So wait a minute, Americans don't have shutters on almost all of their shops. Every small business here has shutters. Every small business, pretty much. Even the big businesses, except for the ones that can just afford new windows.
I ask this because there are times you mentioned having guns as a God-given right. Glad to be American. No, countries have different amounts of guns. Oh, no, I'm sorry. We have to be very, very careful. I'm sorry. Please try to be careful when you contextualize what I say, okay? So right now, I'm having a very fundamental level, philosophical discussion with you. So what I say here is 100% rock solid. This is what I believe fundamentally. When I say you have a God-given right to have a gun in another conversation, I'm talking about with respect to the Second Amendment, with respect to American laws, etc. I don't believe that having a gun is some fundamental right that massively contributes to my internal happiness, that if it's threatened by another person, I can kill them, right? Other countries
God, I wish he'd stop circling that internal happiness, his internal happiness, because the whole point, you're not a subjectivist if you're you're in social contract theory. That's not how that really works. But whatever, man. And even if talking about your internal happiness, right? I think subjectivism is wrong. And I think that's probably where I'd say that you don't understand your internal happiness implicitly. But even then, I would just say there comes to a point in which whether you're actually achieving the means is the social contract. If we assume all of this stuff is actually working, then it would still be the social contract. So we really should be circling that.
I can totally conceive of a world where I live where nobody has guns and we're all totally fine. Yeah. I understand self-defense when it comes to...
I could believe that world existing as being potentially the better world, to be entirely honest with you. I'm not going to lie. I understand that in America it's a different scenario because the guns are already there. But in a country which does not have guns, for example, implementing a right to own a firearm, which creates the likelihood that people are going to buy firearms, no, please don't.
Property like housing and business, but where is the threshold? What about a stick of gum you own or something? I believe that could escalate to a lethal situation, but then that's on the aggressor. For instance, let's say you have a piece of gum, somebody tries to take it from you, no, fuck you.
Whoa. Did he just basically say that you are justified to use lethal force for any amount of property? One, the use of force should be regulated by social contract. That's the point, right? The whole point of central justice is to prevent you from making these decisions and make them in respect of everyone, which is essentially, he is essentially going to be falling in, everyone is going to be murdering each other with this. That's the whole point. That's why John Locke come up with the notion of social contract theory in the way he did. And this is even in Hobbes, the idea of getting us out of the state of war. No, that is going to plummet straight into war.
You pull the gun back. And they say well, fuck you. If you don't give it to me, we're going to fight over it. I'm all right, well, fuck it. Let's fight. Let's say that the person pulls out a knife. It's okay, well, I'm going to fucking stab you. It's okay, we pull out a gun and you kill the person, right? You're not killing them.
Okay, so he's not saying that it's over the gum. He's saying that it's in respect of someone that's going to try and kill you. But then if you could just give him the gum and de-escalate the situation and then take it to court and claim compensation, then that would be the normal social contractist kind of position.
over. Now, the way that people look at this is like, oh, you killed them for a stick of gum. The gum was worth more than their life. No, it's not that the gum was worth more than their life. It's that they made the decision to aggress on me, knowing that their life was on the line for it, and they decided to take that action anyway. And I think that if you've put them on notice and you're defending something and they know the consequences, if they attack you, then that's on them. They decided that their life was worth a piece of gum. That was the choice that they made. You're not responsible for the consequences of their action, even if you're the one doling out the consequences. It's kind of like when a teacher says, I don't give you grades, you earn grades. Just because a teacher fails you on an assignment doesn't mean it's the teacher's fault that you failed. Much the same way that if you're defending property and you've put the other person on notice, I'm going to kill you if you attack me, it's not your fault.
Well, what you've done is you've created a scenario in which the system itself is defending property to the extent in which lethal force is justified for any single amount. You could have a system which prevents. You could have a system which only allows for a certain amount of force in a reasonable amount of force. That's kind of like what most countries actually have. In which case they'd say, give them the gum. Like, you are unjustified using lethal force to protect the gum.
That they died, even if you were the one that ultimately might have killed them attacking the property. What about a mentally ill person? So depending on the level of mental illness, we would say that the mentally ill person isn't considered a moral agent the same way that a child wouldn't be. And that mentally ill person should be under the possession of another entity, either a family or a government or whatever. And that person doing things is a failing of whoever their caretaker should be. Wait, okay, so I do have an issue with you in principle. Do these rules you have, and you're from utilitarianism, have exceptions? Like, if they, in certain circumstances, cause more harm than they prevent? So, in general, I'm not concerned with harm caused to intentionally aggressive parties that understand the harm they might suffer should they do a particular action. I view that as a form of consent. Okay? You're strictly talking morally, right? Yeah, this is strictly morally. Like, in the real world, I don't think that killing people over gum is like a good way to, I don't think it's a good way to run society. Although maybe.
I thought this was applied ethics. I thought that was the whole point. Like, I'm not talking about the real world. I'm just talking about like this nonsense application, like in this utopian or like, well, I don't know if this would be utopian world, like, but like this like alternative reality. It's like, well, that seems a bit strange. Like, it's almost as if like, no, like in the real world, I don't think you should kill people over gum. In my world, in which everyone follows the rules to this extent, you should kill people. You should kill people over gum. I mean, come on, what?
I'm not sure. Destiny, something about this feels off. Like, you can conjure any kind of consequences you want for even minor infractions. Well, in general, I think that like the consequences for breaking a rule, like if we're talking about like public rules for public safety, I think that's a bit different than aggressing on an individual. So, for instance, I don't think that jaywalking could carry a death penalty if the state puts you on notice that they'll kill you if you jaywalk. The same way that aggressing on another individual is the same way. What do you think the long-term ramification of that could be? Someone could then show up with a gun themselves to take that gum. And
why isn't jaywalking permitted, but you can kill people with gum for gum? Like I don't understand. Like, you're like, jaywalking is definitely like, especially since this is all consequentialist. So like, it's in relation to the consequences and not like some sort of like overall. If you see that someone hasn't the must follow a rule, someone hasn't. We're putting property over, for example, public safety. In what realm do we say that someone's jaywalking is not permissible to be shot by the police, but someone who simply tries to thieve gum would be permissibly shot by the police? Like, for example, someone like he even said, someone can use force to defend property of another. Okay, and they have the right to call the police to do that force. Now, let's say there is a scenario in which someone says, I will take your piece of gum. And they say, no, you will not take my piece of gum. I will not let you. They try to do it anyway. And at each point, you put them on notice to the point in which you call the police. Somehow you've managed to keep the gum from them for all this time. The police turn up and he's like still trying to get the gum. And the police warn him, you keep trying to get that gum, we're going to blow your head off. And then he tries to get the gum and they blow his head off. Right? Or even if there was no way otherwise for the police to stop him and they could only kill him and otherwise he'd get the gum, they would be justified in blowing their head off in this scenario through his own application. Some police officer can walk up to a petty crime and say that they weren't following the rules and take a life. This is ultimately dystopian.
And that could be a worse outcome for you, maybe. Well, then you'd call more friends over to do it, I guess. Like, the thing is that, like, the ramifications of my system ultimately ended maybe a civil war if it gets to that level, but then it was always going to get to that level anyway. But the
It wasn't always going to get to that level. You don't say that, oh, my system didn't work, so it's always going to get into civil war. That's a bit arrogant.
ramifications of the other
I mean, like what you could say is that, like,
end are, well, people should just be able to steal and take whatever the fuck they want.
Well, no, you could have someone with a different system that has a different social norms and conventions, which ultimately creates a stable society. You could have different variations of, like, how, for example, punishment. You could have variations of crimes. You could have variations on so many different things in terms of the distribution of wealth and so on.
As long as you can't stop them, since you can't use lethal force. I reject that world. I reject a reality where people can break in, steal shit, fuck with...
And that's a really good point, King Mass, in the chat. Doesn't the jaywalker cause harm by putting his life at risk from being run over? Like, for example, like the jaywalker, I think a good way to look at it is, like, the jaywalker could ultimately cause a car crash, which puts an individual's life at risk. So should the jaywalker be, like, executed if they won't get out the middle of the road,
with people or do whatever because you can't kill them as long as they don't threaten you. I reject that moral world. I think that the internal happiness of more people would be threatened in that world versus another one where, like, hey, if you break in and steal people's shit, they might kill you. Like, I think that in that world, I think that we can be respectful enough of each other's properties and each other's persons that we should.
I mean, this is, like, respectful enough to, like, obey the rules, otherwise you get shot. Why is it that there's such use of force in this social contract scenario anyway? If you're going to talk about applied ethics and legislation, please talk about the limitations of force and rational use of force.
Shouldn't be running into that, like, circumstance too often. Testing morality of guns. Does this scheme require a standing army to protect the society, external agents, and sufficient... Talking about, like, wars with other countries gets more complicated. I don't want to get into that right now. So morally, you are justified in escalating over the gun, but practically, if the item is important to you, you should drop the interaction. Practically, it sounds stupid to kill somebody over gum for a variety of reasons, but morally, if they're put on notice, if they're like fully, like, cognizant, they're not like sleepwalking.
What are you talking about? Like, practically, like, the whole point of it being applied ethics is to say that there's a practicality to ethics. Like, applying my matter ethic and applying the normative ethic should create a scenario which is better, right? So, like, saying, like, in morals it is, like, non-practical but justifiable. Well, like, no, the whole point of applied ethics is to say, like, if there is a scenario which is creating a greater amount of harm overall, or a scenario in which is worse, quote unquote, which is is bad, then overall the systems that come before it haven't been constructed correctly. So yeah, like, that's wrong.
Walking or whatever. I mean, they're making the choice. That's the choice that they're making, right? Here's an example. Let's say that stepping into somebody's backyard, if you know that could kill you, right? Should you do it? Like, okay, well, let's say that you do it and you get killed. Like, if a person kills you, everybody would be outraged. Oh, they just stepped in your backyard. But, like, you kind of accept the consequence. Let's say that, like, a bear lives there instead, right? Well, if you step into the yard and a bear is there, the bear is going to kill you, right? I think that, like, if you know, like, I feel like you consent yourself to that harm. If you know that if you've been put on notice, okay, whether it's a bear roaring at you or an angry old fucking white dude with a rifle pointing at you saying, hey, if you cross this area, I'm going to fucking kill you. Like, you've been put on notice. Like, if you're doing it, to some extent, you're consenting.
But at what point is the notice justifiable, right? That's the kind of, like, the point, right? Like, trespassers will be shot. Right, okay, well, you are wrong for walking down the street in which trespassers will be shot, right, if it's actually trespass. But what if there's a sign there that puts you on notice, but you say that it's unethical? This is a public right of way, which is being justified in terms of, this is a thing in Britain, there are points in which allow individuals to walk across private property throughout the country as a public right of way. You say that this is actually, even though this is private property, I'm allowed to, cut through here. He puts up a sign saying, this is my property. I will shoot you if you go down it. But you say, no, this is a public right of way. Now, this is a confliction of interests, right? Now, it's arguable that either party were justified, right? It might be that he was not on the public right of way, or it might be that, like, the individual was mistaken, whatever, right? It's not so clean cut. But even if it was really clean cut, was the individual justified in taking a life to protect his property from minor trespass? Right. that has to be fleshed out in the social contract theory. Arguing that it is justifiable is saying that all force is justifiable to maintain a particular rule. Not the contract, but a particular rule, which is just nonsense.
To it. Like,
I mean, arguably, that creates far more political instability, which would undermine the contract.
If somebody consents to the consequences you set for them that suggest fucking stupidity on their end, it does not automatically justify the consequences you impose on them. I disagree. I think it 100% automatically justifies the consequences I impose on them. On the flip side, for you, I don't think that somebody being stupid allows them to impose themselves and aggress on your individual rights. That would be the flip side of what you're saying. Well, if somebody's dumb enough, they should be able to aggress on you without consequence. I disagree with that. I reject. So, for instance, I don't consider the morality of a 5 or 6-year-old child. I would consider them to be an extension of their owners, which would be their parents. Or like an extremely mentally ill person, I wouldn't be like morally considering them. I'd be thinking of them as extensions of their caretakers or their family.
But that's, I mean, what happens if they do not have a caretaker, right? And they are not capable of joining the social contract. So let's say a marginal case in which there's an individual who's orphaned, who is, perhaps even been, like, for let's say they're a refugee, right? They're mentally disabled, incapable of signing the contract. Are they no longer morally relevant? Apparently, that means we can do whatever the hell we want to them.
Destiny, I would assume you agree morally with owning some sort of home defense option that kills an illegal entrance onto a property even if no one is home, as long as the person is adequately put on notice, and it's reasonable to assume that they're put on notice, then I think that that's okay. I don't think that most people would violate the property at that point. So, like, there's one really fucked up thing that people do that I don't feel is fair enough in terms of putting on notice. I think some people in,
Like, at what point is notice justified? We haven't even talked about that. Like, you're talking about applying your system, and it's like you haven't spoke about at what point people are justified in using force. At what point people are justified. Like, when you say using force, you're like, you can use any amount of force, not force which is reasonable. At what point is someone justified in giving notice? Well, it's anything that breaks a rule. At what point is anyone who is a bystander justified in enacting a rule? At all times. It seems that all of this is going to create a far more politically unstable environment. Could you imagine? You, as a bystander, are allowed to go and prevent someone from, let's say, stealing a piece of gum who's been warned otherwise numerous times by use of lethal force, and the notice was justified. At what point the notice was given was perhaps maybe too late, and in what form was not necessarily given. Did they have to give Did the individual have to acknowledge the notice? Did the individual have to be able to understand the notice? And so on. There's so many, don't get me wrong, I understand there's a lot of variables that we'd have to kind of like flesh out in this, and that's not necessarily his fault. But at the same time, like saying that someone would be justified to use lethal force to defend any of these socially defined rules, and these are all socially defined rules, once again, in relation to Destiny's individualistic notions of what is good for Destiny, and not actually the inherent good of everyone else. Because again, he says, like, there comes to a point in which him over others, and the if they can't agree, then it's him versus the world, or him versus the power system against them, and there's no ethical foundation from which to rule this out, so we end up in a state of war. So ultimately, this is Destiny's, and even then, even when you get to the point of social contract, it always comes back to his internal happiness, not the system's. So overall, someone tries to steal a piece of gum. At what point is it justifiable to take their life? Depends on whether it's going to maximize his internal happiness. Okay, and that's in relation to other people. Only if that maximizes Destiny's internal happiness. Okay, and at what point in that system is that do we create rules and customs in order to prevent individuals causing unnecessary harm? Again, it depends on Destiny's internal happiness. If Destiny would rather a situation in which people were giving minimum notice and can use lethal force, then they can be given minimum notice and use lethal force. If the opposite is true, then it's true. This is the point. It's far too subjective. The whole point of relating it to a central justice system in the first place is to divorce this kind of individualism.
I wish I had an example of a story. I know I've read a story about this, but there was a guy, I think, that put like zip lines or razor lines or something up at like head level in forests so that if anybody like drove through their forest, they would be decapitated. Wires on ATV trails, yeah. I don't think that that's properly putting somebody on notice. It's totally possible that somebody could drive through, not see a sign. It's totally possible that somebody like just doesn't know about that and then they get killed. I don't think that they consented to that level of potential harm or that risk.
Okay, that we're getting somewhere there. At least that's a little bit better. Like there comes to a point in which like the individual is at least needing to be informed in a proper way. The individual but then there is a justifiable amount of risk, right? But then he needs to go back on the gum thing, I think, because I don't think that taking someone's life, living in a society in which someone can take someone's life to protect property so minor as gum is a justifiable amount of risk even.
By doing that, yeah. Being put on notice is one thing, Destiny. The issue seems to be that they should be able to explain their notice, such as X is required for their livelihood or is sentimental, and not just simply because they put out a notice. This is absurd to the point of being relentless. It needs to be a reasonable limit to defensive property. I disagree. Totally disagree. I don't believe that it's moral. So I'll flip this around on you then. So in NXT, so I'm going to flip the question around on you. Do you think that as long as some piece of property, let's say that as long as some... So here's my problem. Ready? Okay, two premises. Okay, here we go. Let's say that I am sufficiently strong enough that I could kill anybody in hand-to-hand combat. 1. And 2, let's say that I can identify a piece of property that is yours that isn't like necessary to your livelihood or well-being. Okay? Does that mean that I should be able to freely destroy any of that property that I want? Because that seems to be the logical extension of your system. If the only...
No, they could just hold you to the laws and conventions of society, which would force you to compensate at a later date. Like, you do not need to use lethal force or an unreasonable amount of force to prevent the attack. You could allow the attack to occur and then seek compensation at a later date. John Locke.
The only way to stop me is to kill me, and I can identify some piece of property of yours that I can destroy that's not essential to your well-being or livelihood. Should I be able to just do that over and over and over again? Destiny, do you really think of taxation as theft? Isn't it just the cost of service you receive from the nation? Well, no. I mean, more wealthy people probably pay a greater percentage than they get back. I mean, whether or not it's theft is a bit tautological. Some people consider theft the unjust taking of something. So by definition, theft is already bad. But I mean, theft in terms of just like taking something from you. I mean, like taxation is theft in that way. But I mean, I consider like a moral form of theft. But some people say that theft is always immoral, kind of like a moral murder. People.
Yeah, I'd take theft to be typically like theft is typically a moral crime. It's a crime. It's an unjustified taking of property.
I'd call it not murder, but killing. So people wouldn't say it's theft. It's more like an exchange of goods, service, right? Yeah. I'm confused as to what the good is and what is utilitarianism. So the good is an individual's happiness is what the good is, basically. And then the rule utilitarianism point of view I put is like, what type of like rules can we put?
Yeah, he's not a subjectivist. He's an egoist. Rule utilitarianism's being used in terms of social contract theory in order to create an overall society which maximizes the expression of the good, which is the individual's happiness. I don't think he's doing that very well with his social contract theory, I'm afraid. I don't think that he's justified in arguing for social contract theory, and I think that his understanding of internal happiness is very flawed.
Put out to ensure that we're reciprocating values amongst everybody that guarantees the internal happiness of as many people as possible. Destiny, if you are talking in a moral vacuum for the gum scenario and there's only the binary, it takes my gum or I kill them, then I agree, but this is so abstracted from reality. Okay, you have to stop this, okay? If I ask an engineer, okay, an architectural engineer is very fucking rarely going to have to deal with like 3 + 9, probably ever. Never. Actually, never, because math doesn't exist in the real world. I'm a mathematical anti-realist, okay? If you were to ask an architectural engineer, hey, what's 3 + 9? And they were to say, what?
Well, I mean, I'd like to think that architecture has very much mathematically, has a lot of maths in it, actually. I mean, if you talk about like the amount of like load a beam can handle, for example, usually talk about the capacity of force, like Pascals and stuff, like Young's modulus, and there's like physics guys, right? And there's maths in physics, believe it or not. Are maths and science is maths related to science?
Do you mean to ask me what are 3 I-beams by 9 I-beams, or what is like a 2x4 piece of wood, or what is like a 3 plus 9. What an absurd hypothetical. I've never seen 3 plus 9.
Ah, right. I think I get what he's saying. He's talking about like something which is like maths itself, but then maths is like the language of physics.
In all my days of architecture. What a stupid and foolish question. If you can't answer an abstracted, simplistic, absurd hypothetical, that means that you don't have this foundation. You have no moral principles to stand on, and instead you're appealing to some vague form of intuition to try to generate you moral answers, and you can't have the conversation. You absolutely, if I ask you a thing in a vacuum, you should be able to give me a yes or no answer. Now, if that yes or no answer disagrees with the practical application, then you should be able to explain why as well. LOL Destiny, you just talked through the example of whether or not killing someone.
Right, so is he actually arguing the opposite of what I thought he was arguing? Like, was he saying, like, the engineer should know maths? Like...
over gun was morally justified. Do you understand what I just said? Does he not understand what I just said? Do most of you understand what I just said? Do most of you understand why this guy's comment is really fucking stupid? Or Destiny, booby traps are not considered self-defense because they're proactive and not reactive. It has nothing to do with giving someone sufficient notice. You have to react to imminent danger from a neutral state. In other words, you must be the agent that responds into the danger. It cannot be automatic. That's why you're not culpable. You're talking about legal shit. I don't give a fuck. I don't care. I don't know why I just wasted my time reading that argument. I think murder should be in the societal contract to be in the hands of the police/professional problem solver as a last resort in problem cases and not the... Okay. So what all of you have to answer, and you could bite the bullet on this because we might have a fundamental disagreement here, is what you have to say is, if certain people are trying to destroy your property and the only way you have to defend yourself is through lethal means, do you always have to just back off and let them destroy whatever they want? I don't think that I should have to compel another person to do that, okay? If a woman has spent 20 years building her perfect garden and she has it and she loves it and that's what she spent her life doing or whatever, and some guy is walking up with a Molotov cocktail saying, I'm going to burn all...
Okay, yeah, but their perfect garden, someone's life. Right. I know it sounds kind of like ridiculous, but the whole point is that even like if we look at like justice as an exchange of value, like a Hegelian response to how we should punish people, would be talking about like your ability to hold private property. Your ability to be a rational agent means that you're actually in a when you commit a crime, you're actually in a somewhat a value exchange with an individual, and so the amount of harm that you do, it ultimately should be kind of exchanged back towards yourself to say that there is an actual exchange going on, that you are a rational agent that can understand the consequences of your actions. Like overall, if we were to accept that, like the individual who's or even like even if we weren't to accept that, like in most scenarios you talk about like a value exchange and a social contract scenario, like this individual like can obtain compensation for that garden. You could say that the amount of hours that I put into that garden, the amount of like love and attention I have given to that garden, how much would that have cost me in terms of like the value that I put upon that, the value that is judgeable off like what we would call like abstract like exchange value, like maybe you wouldn't exchange it, but ultimately you would say that like it may have like a overall market value, and then otherwise you could say it could have you talk about labor and so on, right? The market value of that sort of thing, like abstract human labor, and the production of value. And you would put a point in which you'd be able to understand a principle of compensation, which would or a point of compensation in which you are justified in claiming compensation back from the state for being unable to protect you, and from the individual who should be fined as much as possible, right? It's kind of like John Locke, right? In this scenario, like you would still be unjustified, I think, for most social contracts in taking a life.
All of your shit to the fucking ground. And the woman can very easily run away and be safe. The woman can very easily back off, and the guy's not going to kill her. He just wants to destroy her fucking shit or whatever. I don't think that I have a right to compel the woman to abandon her stuff and say, "Oh, sorry, you got to let him kill his shit." I don't think so. I think that she has a right to say, "Listen to me. I'm putting you on notice. If you're going to continue to advance and you're going to try to destroy my shit, I'm going to kill you." Now the ball is in your park, okay? You can make the choice.
But the point is that the state would outline, the whole point of social contract is that the state would outline whether you are justified or not in taking that action. So like ultimately justice is centralized. It has to be.
whether or not you want to accept that consequence, but now the choice is yours. I've told you what's going to happen if you do it. I think the woman has every right to defend her property in that case. I don't think that she has to be compelled. I don't think she has to be compelled to abandon her stuff against a would-be attacker. I feel that it's really hard for people to overcome the absurdity of a situation. So frustrating. Sure. That's your example of us continually adding things to the pile of items, destroy it. At a certain point, that pile of near worthless items becomes worth something correct. Also, the time required to defend items of little worth. I agree that you should be able to defend items of value. I'm just wondering what the lower limit reasonably is. I don't know. If I go to the extreme hypothetical that I'm given, I don't know if I think there needs to be a lower limit. I think that if you sufficiently put somebody on notice and you've exhausted all other means to get them to back off and they continue to push.
Well, this is the thing, like sufficiently put on notice. Well, that needs to be defined in the social contract, arguably. But in his system, like sufficiently, like what are the metrics? The value of the object is irrelevant, and the amount of force is also irrelevant. So the only thing that he thinks is against the consequences of broader society and himself is whether they are sufficiently put on notice. Right. So overall, he seems to believe that his internal happiness would ultimately be benefited from the individual being able to use lethal force to protect any property whatsoever without, so long as they give the proper notification to the individual. You're going to end up in a state of war just on whether people arguing about whether your action was justified, as in like, did you use excessive force? And because you're not even engaging in the conversation of excessive force, and the state is not engaging in that conversation, you are once again going to end up in the state of war. And even at the point in what is sufficient notice, that needs to be justified against a metric.
Then I think that you have a right to defend it with lethal force every time. That's someone in Twitch had asked, if you don't consider children moral agents in your world, could killing them with the consent of both parents be moral? If you don't consider children moral agents in your world, could killing them with the consent of both parents be moral? Ooh, that's...
Go on, bite the bullet. You're not a vegan. Go on. He's gonna have to, surely.
Really interesting.
Otherwise, he's gonna talk about like me and my moral disgust at the idea of someone being killed, which is not morally considerable in the social contract, even though what is considerable to me really in the social contract is my own ability for internal happiness. So if you live in a society which is amoral to the idea of children being executed out of sight, or if the child could be executed without the knowledge of the broader society.
Interesting question. Intuitively, the answer is no. Why is the answer no? I've always joked.
I mean, you can't do that. You can't intuitively no. And that's why he's saying he's a subjectivist, because he's like, how can I inductively prove everything I'm saying? But it's a deductive argument. You're trying to make a deductive argument, but you're like, oh, I just feel like it's wrong.
The thing is there's an old Peter Singer argument for abortion that allows you to abort your kids up to like 3 or 4 years old, I think. Just because you don't have moral... Okay.
I think Peter Singer was actually arguing against from what I remember, Peter Singer was actually arguing against being able to do that. He was just showing the consequences of a position.
Okay.
I think.
Okay, I think this is a disconnect. Just because you don't have moral agency doesn't mean you don't have moral consideration. I think that those are two fundamentally separate properties.
Okay, so now he's having to put in something else, which is moral consideration and relates to extrinsic consideration from another individual. So like, I care about children, I care about, the disabled, and because it reflects my happiness, therefore they have value. However, if we are all, obviously, being the primary signers of the social contract, believe that we don't give a shit about, let's say, I don't know, a certain race, we are justified in allowing harm to being committed to that person so long as they are not morally as long as they're not capable of signing a social contract. So if we all have a distaste for an individual, or like, for example, if we all have a distaste for, let's say, the Queen or something like that. Let's say like all of Britain suddenly hates the Queen, and the Queen at the same time falls down the stairs and becomes like severely disabled mentally. Then apparently we can do whatever we want to her. Now, I don't believe that, and I'm a socialist, right? and I just think that ultimately your ability to have moral consideration isn't dependent upon your rationality. Why would reason denote the capacity to be morally relevant? The only reason that it's morally relevant here is because your capacity to reason is directly proportional to my individualistic, quote unquote, notion of happiness. Now, why, the whole point is I would just argue against social contract. I just say that social contract theory is wrong. That its notions of ethics or of metaethics are ad hoc. That it cannot give a foundation of what internal happiness is and what it's actually being based off. I would say that internal happiness and the consideration of the individual, of what we are considering when we are trying to reflect what is good in terms of ethics, the goal that we are trying to seek in terms of happiness, quote unquote, is actually based off value simplicity, and that value response has absolutely nothing to do with reason. Value, the evaluation of the world is not a rational construction. It's an emotive construction. It's a subjective construction. It can be influenced by rationality and modified by rationality, but it is not the construction of rationality.
So I think that a child can have no moral agency, but I think that they still must be endowed with some level of moral consideration, would be the response to that. Why are they? This is a deeply unsatisfying answer. But the reason why they are is because they're humans, and that's it. That's the only answer. There is no reason why. I don't think...
It can't be deductive if there's no reason why. I mean, arguably, to steal Manny's point, I think he's trying to say that the internal happiness of the individual is dependent upon the respect of certain properties that they value in themselves.
I don't think that morality is a real thing. I don't think there's a good way to answer it. But I would like...
I don't believe morality is a real thing. This is a very big argument to believe that morality doesn't exist.
I would build that answer into my internal happiness model. And in terms of like reciprocated values, that like in order for society to function...
So like, wait a minute, it's just all of this. Nah, it doesn't exist, man. I'm only joking. Like, come on, morality doesn't exist. This whole like hour-long video is just a load of like, come on, man. Like the whole point is he's an egoist. He's not a subjectivist, and he's constructing a system which he is arguing relates to like morality. But even like subjectivism, arguably, it's wrong, but it is still arguing for morality. In one case, I suppose. But if we're talking about like true moral anti-realism, like nihilism, or arguably like what subjectivism is founded upon, then the reality is that everything that he's laid out here is meaningless nonsense anyway. So I don't understand.
Children need to be able to grow up and be happy and healthy, and that if we had a society where people were just allowed to kill children on a whim, that society would probably be pretty fucked. Extend that to animals then. Or what about a hypothetical proto-human thawing from hypothetical proto-human things get interesting. Animals I don't really care about because animals don't represent any threat to internal happiness ever.
Well, unless we're all vegan, or your understanding of yourself and your actual capacity to understand what is valuable. I'd say that you have to reflect what is subjective, what is their subjectivity simpliciter, what is value simpliciter. Simpliciter means like universally, right? So what is universally valuable, and your understanding of universal valuation is essentially the means to understand yourself, because to understand yourself and your desire, and what you're desiring and how to achieve it and so on, has to be non-biased. Otherwise you're just ad hocing and assuming that what was going to cause that happiness response. So overall, like your understanding of how to respect the interests of subjective beings is the purpose of ethics, which is the only means of achieving happiness. Otherwise, you're open to the principle of explosion, which you talked about at the start of this debate. And actually, if anyone's interested, check out on my channel My Debate with Destiny, which I outline an objective system of ethics, my objective system of ethics, which I think explains the need for psychological recognition of the other's desires as a means to even achieving your own desire.
It's a pretty cold or fucked up answer, but I think it's the only good one. So not morally responsible, but still the subject of morality. Yeah. Destiny, why are so many leftists opposed to any form of civilized militia? Based off your reasoning, wouldn't it generally be positive something with respect to protecting people's internal happiness? Do you consider yourself an ally? I don't know. I don't know much about militias. If they're reformed responsibly, then sure. You could also go with the real point of view. We cannot exist in a world we could have been executed as children, therefore we ought to not execute children. Yeah, maybe, yeah. I think that children still have like internal happiness that needs to be respected, right? And children can also contribute to the internal happiness of other people. Do we consider capacity to gain moral sentience is considered moral worth? No, we don't go by future. We don't evaluate a current person based on future probabilities. If that was the case, then we would be like pro-life. We would have to be anti-abortion. But I don't think that we can make current decisions now, like weighing like I don't think that we can consider like a non-existent life.
I mean, you could talk about overall society and the progression of society and the overall possibility. I mean, we don't talk about society as if what will create the greatest overall happiness right now, immediately, because otherwise you are going to create like a society which could be politically unstable and ultimately devolve into civil war and not be absolutely justified. What you're talking about essentially is your own internal happiness. Do you really understand your own internal happiness within an imminent understanding of reality? No, it's conceptual, it's narrative, right? It goes from past, present, and future, right? My understanding of myself now it relates to my understanding of myself in the past and the actions that I've done and my understanding of where I'm going to be tomorrow and how I'm going to live my life. All of these things are incredibly necessary to create an ethical understanding of how I should behave. The whole point of behavior isn't just talking about like what do I want preferably right now. It's talking about my relation to a social contract in this scenario even is about creating the life that is worth living. And if my life ultimately becomes not worth living because I'm being a hedonist, then that would be unethical in this schemata, in this system. So yeah, like there has to be some talk about like not necessarily potential life and all that sort of stuff, like pro-life. Like I'm not saying that, but like because you don't necessarily have to have the children. But what you do have to talk about is the concept of what is good throughout time.
I don't think that non-existent life has moral consideration. If that makes sense. Do you think a person can sanely forfeit their moral consideration by taking the gum? No, I mean, they could do it for a few reasons. Maybe they think they won't suffer a punishment. Maybe, I don't know. They could do it for a few reasons. Do you have a different take on the moral, intelligent animal? No, I don't care. I don't care about any animals. It just has to be by humans, yeah. So you admit that this is just a personal thing made up and morality doesn't exist. Yes, Edgelord 666666. I already said that, yeah.
But this is the thing, like, it's kind of all bollocks then. Yeah, just all bollocks. Like, it's like he talks about this point of truth and consistency, and that's what makes it meaningful. Yet it's all essentially only then meaningful to Destiny because it's all based off Destiny's private notion of internal happiness and his private notion of justifications. And all of this is private to Destiny. So with the ability to communicate this, it's impossible anyway, at least in terms of being a meaningful communication of his ideas, because these are all based off his private evaluations of the world. Like where's the meaning? Like no. This is exactly why, like, this is the no.
Destiny, this doesn't mesh with your other beliefs, and you are somehow going over it quickly. The reason you value other people is because they can uphold the social contract. Children cannot do so. Children should only be given rights insofar as it benefits other adults. Yeah, but I mean, I think that's generally what we do, right? Like, children are only given rights. Like, we violate the rights of children all the time, right? So, for instance, we force them to go to school, we force them to go to bed, we force them to eat food that they might not want to eat. But we generally do all of these things for like the well-being of the child, right? Typically, anything that we force a child to do against its will, we're ultimately doing it for their own well-being, under the assumption that.
Yeah, I think the dragon spirit, I think that's exactly right. I think he's just trying to justify his own actions, which is ironically inductive. So this whole argument based on his moral theory anyway, based because what he just said, that all of it's subjective, that all of it's meaningless, and that none of it is in any way related to an ontologically real scenario. It's all ad hoc justifications trying to inductively justify his actions. It's all ad hoc. He's constructing a system based off his preconceived conclusion, rather than coming to a conclusion and then using that via like constructing like from the evidence available.
that these guys aren't capable moral agents that can make these decisions on their own, right? And then once they're 18, then they are capable of making these on their own. I agree. I would just say for edge case scenarios, killing children could be a net good, i.e. euthanizing excess kids due to population pressures or perhaps extreme illness or mental problems. Yeah.
Like some vegan foot soldier, welcome. If he is trying to draw a cock, that would explain considerably more. That would. I want to be trolled here. Please tell me that this is all bollocks and actually bollocks. Like that is a pair of bollocks and not a moral system.
Yeah, it's possible. It could be, sure. That gets into some very uncomfortable eugenics conversations. However, I will say, I think that a lot of pro-choice people unintentionally make eugenics arguments anyways. So for instance, when pro-choice people say, like, listen, it might be a life, but I think you should be able to abort in cases of like incest or in cases where the fetus is like severely mentally disabled, that's a eugenics argument. Can you explain the hypothetical of a business dying due to another business for a
Well, I mean, like, eugenics is about like is it a eugenics argument? Because you're not trying to, like, for example, like, you can make an argument that the, like, overall harm, it could be like double effect. You're not like trying to create eugenics, you're trying to prevent harm. Eugenics seems to be, I mean, it depends on how we define it. Like, eugenics isn't necessarily the production of a genetically pure quote unquote scenario. That's what I would take eugenics to be, like genetically modifying the overall schemata of society to fit a certain end, whence what could be argued is that there are justifiable times to take action to prevent life in order to maximize the well-being of individuals, and including the individual themselves, which sometimes includes genetics. So like sometimes it would be like someone was in a car crash, the child was severely injured. In that time, somehow oxygen was cut off, and so their brain development has been severely hindered. Because of that, they will be born, like, for whatever reason, incapable of taking a breath without suffering greatly or something ridiculous, right? Like, I don't know. In that scenario, you could argue that abortion is justified because of the harm the individual will face. You are preventing their harm, right? Rule of double effect. Now, on the other hand, eugenics would be like, what attribute genetically or is occurring here? How can we remove them from the gene pool? So I don't know, like
a group of people destroying
maybe we mean the same thing.
People were saying those are the same thing. So in society, we have the ability to compete with other people based on our economic organization, right? Currently our system is organized under a system of capitalism. Whoever can deliver the cheapest goods and services at the highest qualities to people are hopefully the ones that survive in the market and live in the market.
That is not how capitalism works. Who can provide the cheapest goods and services? Yeah. Who can make the most profit? Yeah. Actually, you know what? Who can make the most profit? It doesn't even matter, right? Because arguably someone could provide more expensive services and then survive, or, you know, it's just who makes the most profit. And it could also be based off like futures and like stocks, right? Like, in which case, like, it doesn't, like, it's all mystical anyway. So profit. That's all capitalism is. Like, the mindset of drawing as much profit from a corporation as absolutely possible. How can you take as much money from one place in the market and move it to another place in the market and make sure that that market doesn't actually function correctly? No, I mean, but yeah, I mean, like, ultimately, like, capitalism is just profit seeking.
Okay. If somebody moves in and they outcompete you, that's part of the contract that we have with each other. Okay, fine. Like, that happens, right? Much the same way that if I have a crush on a girl and I really like her and I'm better.
But what if they outcompete you to the point in which they are monopolizing? Which prevents individuals from actually living in a society which capitalism functions correctly, and ultimately prevents the correct function of private property. You could have a private property destroying itself, like what I think John Locke argues, people like Adam Smith, classical liberals, who are mostly arguing for social contract. Bloody hell.
Better guy comes along for her and she dates him. I can't kill that guy because he took my girl and it decreased my happiness. The same way that if somebody outcompeted a business, I can't just kill them because they like outcompeted my business. Like, that's not how that works. you wouldn't be justified in doing that. Now,
well, you wouldn't be justified in doing that, but then it's in harm to your property. So, like, I thought that property was defensible in any way which is reasonable, like, to any extent, and there's no point in reasonability so long as you give them notice. So long as you give, like, I don't know, your competition notice that that you will kill them if you take my market. So, if, like, I don't know, like, I own, like, a range of, like, I don't know, like, vegan fast food joints, right? And then somebody else makes vegan fast food joints as well. And we are going to compete over the same market. Now, he has the opportunity to take my property, right? In the sense that my property also, in many scenarios, and this isn't just like, I'm not saying this abstractly, I'm saying that, like, people will sue for potential profits lost, right? So he potentially infringes upon my property rights, or he infringes upon my property rights in the sense that when I go out of business, these are essential for my internal happiness and so on. So my social contract, as he says, is now being violated, right? Why can't I take action? Like, all of this is so messed up. He's a subjectivist and a social contract theorist. No, doesn't work. His normative ethic is applicable against internal happiness alone, and not the social contract. That doesn't work. If you do include the social contract, there are things that he allows to be justified against internal happiness, which would not be justifiable against overall happiness, which is nonsense again. And then in terms of applied ethics as a whole, I really think that he's basing this all off moral intuition.
Somebody showed up and, like, set your business on fire or stole money from you or whatever. Like, yeah. Destiny, ignoring future happiness seems to have some problems. Climate change may not be perfect, but do you think that extinction level events 200 years from now, which causes that originate particularly from now, have no more relevance? Yeah, I don't think so. That sucks, but I don't see a good argument for it. Intuitively, that feels really bad for me to say, but, like, yeah, it seems hard. Thankfully, intuitively, I kind of get around this by saying that, like, well, climate change impacts we are feeling now and in our lifetime, so we ought to do something about it. But I have, like, a really hard time. If I go back to, like, the 1700s or the 1800s and people were starting to invent things like light bulbs or whatever, or we started to get, like, the early inventions of medicine, and I say, hey, stop industrializing. You're going to hurt the earth 400 years from now. Your lives need to keep sucking, and you need to keep dying from disease. I don't know, like, what moral compulsion that person would feel. Like, fuck. Well, bad things might happen to people in the future that I'm never going to see, never going to meet 400 years from now. They might not even exist. They might all kill themselves before then. I guess I should make sacrifice now. I don't know how you could morally compel somebody to do that. So if I could put...
But then this is the guy that says that he just abstractly values humanity itself. Like, I value all humans right now, but not humans then, not humans in the past, or, like, whatever. Like, I value humans right now. That's the only thing that he could say, really, isn't it? Like, that it's temporal. Like, I value every human that I could ever come into contact with. Any human that's outside that scenario, I do not value. And it's all ad hoc. Like, it's like there's no principles, and, like, as he kind of talking about, like, we talk about rule utilitarianism. Where are the rules, man? Like, it's like, how do I feel right now?
A bomb underground that will explode 200 years.
And someone said, like, how is subjective ethics, egoism, and social contract theory contradictory? Well, egoism and social contract theory isn't. Subjectivism and egoism is contradictory because one's objective and one's subjective. And social contract theory and subjectivism is contradictory because subjectivism relies upon individualistic notions of justice, which would otherwise be centralized. So yeah, like, I think that's obvious.
Of the earth, would that be, I mean, if there was a serious benefit to putting that bomb around, maybe, I don't know. I think it'd be morally wrong for me to place a nuke underground would blow. Well, like, the thing about placing the nuke underground is, like, well, fuck, does it benefit you now? Like, if it just doesn't, if it's just fucking shit up, that just seems like kind of shitty. That doesn't seem to be good at all, right? What would be your argument against eugenics? You seem to reject it outright. I don't argue against eugenics at all. I think that there are some totally valid forms of, like, eugenic arguments. But the only problem that I have with eugenics it's not the problem with eugenics. It's a problem with telling other people what they can or cannot do reproductively. That's generally my issue with eugenics. But I mean, like, I think some form of eugenics is, like, perfectly fine. Say, for instance,
What about incest? Like, telling people that they can and cannot do reproductively. But then I guess the whole point of it is, like, overall, like this is again, it's hard to work out what he's trying to maximize here. Like in terms of his normative ethic and his meta ethic, it's kind of a bit of a mess. Like, sorry, man, but like, you keep saying internal happiness, but then it's supposed to relate to societal happiness, and then or it kind of flips between them both.
Parkinson's, the like ultra like genetically heritable disease. Yeah, there are like certain diseases like these like genetic diseases that like are super highly transmissible or whatever. If we could eradicate these diseases by like doing like egg implants or like sperm donations or whatever, like I think that would be like a positive form of eugenics, is avoiding those types of pregnancies. I think that would be like okay. Eugenics for like people that like look a certain way, that gets a little bit weird. I don't think that's a good thing, but
eugenics for people that look a certain way, that gets a little bit weird.
Oh yeah, Huntington's disease, sure. Do you believe in objective morality? Of course not. The DDoS?
Of course not. Like the majority of professors, for example, that study philosophy and ethics professors believe in objective morality. But of course, I don't believe in objective morality because I'm Destiny and I know better. And don't get me wrong. Like I'm not saying that makes objective morality true. I'm just saying that I hate hearing such arrogance. It's always like, of course, I don't believe in objective morality. It's so stupid. Like, but at the same time, like they've not read very much philosophy and they've not really engaged in philosophy to the point in which, like they've heard the arguments beyond God, Plato, the very basics, like Kant, like not Kant's not basic actually, Kant's actually definitely not basic, but like basic Kant is what they've heard. They've heard like, oh well, like follow the rules because it is like, like here's your duty, do duty for duty's sake, and then they're like, oh my god, like that's clearly wrong, and then they're like, oh right, well objective ethics must be wrong. Like no.
This kid was a Twitch streamer. Can you not kill him since he's depriving you of your income as part of a competitive market? DDoSing somebody is not part of a competitive market. Much the same that going to somebody's store and burning it down is not part of a competitive market.
Somebody said that I have to be considerate of Destiny being, maybe a novice in this respect, like as in like a layman, and they didn't say that, but I'm saying that. Primarily because he's just not had to have like forced education on this. Like I've done education and I needed to know the terms, and sometimes I get the terms wrong, and we can all get the terms wrong, and so he says that he confuses these terms and speaks ambiguously a lot, and I get that, right? Like he might be confusing the terms, he might be speaking in a way that's he's trying to express a point and he might know how to express it, and that's fair enough, right? I actually really appreciate Destiny doing what he's doing, because at least he's doing more than most other people, right? Like he's actually trying, and so like I actually really do appreciate that. What the issue is, I think I am actually being quite charitable. Like I don't think I'm holding them like super stringently to like definitions. I'm just trying to get the concept from them, and I'm struggling to get that concept. Maybe it's just me.
You're like destroying somebody's business, like through an aggressive action to just like destroy or disuse their property or whatever, right? Assuming it was a legal action? No, if it was a legal action, then that's fine. If that's like part of the game, if people are like, oh, like DDoSing, whatever, that's like part of like the competition of streaming, then sure, that's fine. But that's because everybody in that has made that agreement, right? That's part of that contract that everybody has with each other. All right, I got like 2 more of these. I'm fucking tired, okay? Destiny, if attacking, retreating people isn't self-defense, since you have other options to deal with a threat, with this contradict the idea that attacking conservatives can be self-defense, since you also have the option... Other options where attacking conservatives don't actually mitigate through being deported. Example. Oh, yeah, sure. Like, I don't think that attacking all conservatives is necessarily 100% immediately morally justifiable. This would be like a last resort type thing if all voting and all other measures have failed or whatever, sure. Is there any legal action a business can take to destroy your income which warrants a violent response? The thing is that legality should codify our laws. Legality, the law should be a codification of our morals.
I actually completely agree about that. And not all morals. It should be a codification of justice and how not to, trespass upon each other's subjectivity.
If we're all operating under the same laws, then we should generally accept those business practices as being competitive. And like, just because somebody outcompetes us doesn't mean that we should, be like, we have to go kill them. However, the law is downstream from morality, meaning codify. Just because something is legal, a law, doesn't necessarily mean it's moral. So it is possible that a business could engage in such an unbelievably aggressive action that even though it is the law, you reject it, you disagree with it, you think that law exists in some way, and then you could start taking escalating measures that could end with violence. So for instance, however, killing an individual would rarely be the solution. But like, for instance, let's say that it's legal to dump waste in a lake that like is destroying a town. Well, fuck, you could picket the business. Maybe that doesn't work. You could start protesting the business. You could boycott them. Maybe that doesn't work. You could start destroying the roads that lead to the business. If their pollution of your water is literally destroying your village, then you could burn down their factory. You could start
I want to know what he thinks people in Flint should be doing right now. Like, what are the people with poisoned water supplies? What should we be doing right now?
you could escalate to violent measures to make them.
To be fair, I think we'll all agree the government should have done more.
Them stop, like if they're getting workers to show up and like fight the fires and blah blah, and they're still polluting, you could attack the workers if it comes down to that. Yeah, for sure. In that sense, you could escalate. Yeah. But it's impossible for the government to take a law that takes into account everyone's individual morality. Well, that's the goal of the government. It should. Most laws should take into account, like...
That's absolutely ridiculous. That's absolutely impossible. Like, individualistic morality. Like, and he's saying that's the goal of the government, but then the government itself has a goal which is determined by the people in power who have an individualistic morality. And since he's saying it's subjective, then the government is being held to a standard which is objective from the people who are creating the government. So, other words, there is an objective standard from which the government are being held to in relation to those individuals being governed. I think at the end of the day, it's just going to have to go like, I think the government should do this. It's not that the government are obligated. It's that I think the government should. I think the government would be great if it did this. But that's like not how it works, is it? Like ultimately, if the government wants to be exploitative because they're the ones in power and that would represent their internal happiness to a greater extent, I don't even know why they should sign your social contract. They're the ones in charge of ideology and hegemony. Like they can take control of the state, use everyone as a means to an end, and achieve their internal happiness to a greater degree in terms of egoism. Why shouldn't they? And I don't think you could give an argument as to why not, especially since he's a subjectivist. So there's nothing to appeal to, even in terms of like individualistic interests.
Like almost everybody's like individual preferences. They should, yeah. If Kyle Rittenhouse threatened to kill the dude before the dude started chasing him, he would be the aggressor and not in the wrong, right? Yeah, but the thing is, once Kyle started running, I think he would have like dropped that. That would have been a de-escalation, and then killing him past that point, I don't think is okay. Okay, one more question, and then I'm going to sleep. Okay. Destiny, don't plenty of laws exist that should exist that don't necessarily codify morality? For example, we can say that we should have laws of...
Can you have a law, just to answer that question, don't many laws that should exist do exist that don't codify morality? Well, if it's ethics, if it's ethically justified, then it's a law that's ethically justified, so it should exist, well, then it's ethically justified. So for a law to say that a law ought to exist is a moral statement. It's an ethical statement, isn't it? So, like, no, there can't be a law that ought to exist that defies ethics.
Limits, and that running speed limit as an individual is not necessarily immoral. If we believe that the law is a reflection of morality, then we would argue that it would be immoral. So, for instance, if speed limits exist because they represent a desire to keep roads safe, and we acknowledge that going past a certain speed limit creates an unsafe or hazardous condition that can create the conditions that increase the risk towards other people's well-being, then in that case, speeding would be immoral. Sure. We can do more of these later. I hope that like something that I hope to demonstrate in answering these questions, I hope something that you maybe see, or maybe you don't, maybe it's all voodoo magic or whatever. Even if maybe you disagree with some of my underlying premises, like I would hope that like when you ask me a question and I'm able to talk through it and answer it fairly quickly, that it becomes obvious that like even if you disagree with some of these underlying foundations, by having this underlying foundation, you can ask me like a relatively difficult question, but I can talk through it like pretty quickly because I just have to appeal to like my my fundamental principles here. Like, oh, well, what if this thing were to happen? That would be crazy. It's like, okay, that would be crazy. Well, let's think. Right?
But then I think that he's right there, and I think he does a better job than most people. I will actually say this. But then ultimately, I think a lot of the time he just relies upon his intuition anyway. Oop, bloody hell. Some piano for you.
Are we aggressing on somebody's happiness? Like, if we are, like, can this person take reasonable steps to stop it? Like, if they can, like, are they doing so? Like, or like, if you're aggressing on somebody's happiness, is that a reasonable aggression? Like, there are questions we can ask. We can very quickly get down to like, what is the answer? Like, yes or no. As long as we have these like initial fundamental positions figured out. There might be some like really weird, tricky questions, like, what if we create an AI that turns into a human being that is sufficiently intelligent? Like, that might get like a little bit strange. Because unfortunately, I have to bake in an arbitrary assumption here that the only individual happiness that matters is humans. That's just a thing. Some people here will do sentient life, in which case you would use this exact same moral system to be vegan. But yeah, it's called the U.S.
So yeah, thank you very much, guys. There we go. We got through it. We got through it all. I hope you've enjoyed this stream and my response, my reaction to Destiny. That was my first time watching the video, apart from the 3 times that I started the video over and over again because I messed the start of the stream up. But yeah, that was. I hope you have enjoyed it. If you did like it and you did enjoy it, please give it a thumbs up. I'm going to be staying on for the next 10 minutes or so, and then I'm going to have to go. So if you want to ask a question, fire away. If you want your question to get answered sooner, then send a donation and it will hit the top of the list. You can do text-to-speech for £5 and a text donation for £2 to get your question answered sooner. If you're interested in a comprehensive introduction to Western philosophy, an upcoming course that I'm creating, then join the Discord server below and you can enter the raffle on the raffle section of the Discord. All you have to say is raffle or enter me and you will be entered into the raffle. 1 entry per person. So yeah. Good luck to everyone who enters. So yeah. What did you guys think? Did you think that it was that I made any decent points against what he was talking about, or did you think that I was full of it? Somebody says, why must morality be objective? Morality must be objective because what we do in terms of our basic behaviors is a function. We are trying to achieve an end. To understand how to achieve that end to the greatest possible degree, whether it's and what that end actually is to investigate the ontology of ourselves, is to investigate what we are. And to investigate what we are, we have to recruit other individuals, because to psychologically or to evaluate my psyche, I require another individual. I do not get an implicit understanding of reality. Even in terms of creating and metaphysically divesting anything from reality, I require the construction of language. To divest one object from another, I must destroy it from this totality, this immediate present, and turn this raw sense datum into concepts from which I can understand, like camera. And to do that, I require a linguistic structure, which allows me to codify certain ideas in relation to certain objects and their proper application, and the proper application of that concept and that word is defined objectively from me. Otherwise I could just assert that it is the case every single time, which means that there would never be a case when I would be able to understand reality. Everything could be itself and not itself at the same time. So to make deductively valid inferences, I require other individuals. And that includes about understanding myself and how to behave within the world. And we are forced into that. In the words of Aristotle, all men desire to know. And so what I would say is then we are forced into understanding certain notions of value, for example, certain notions of what is the good life for me. And if I'm trying to understand my ontology, I end up with what Aristotle says, what is the good life for man? I end up engaging in universals, things from which I am not ad hocing a notion of value to. And so when I'm engaging with these universals, what I do is try and evaluate what is the universal that we are trying to respect in terms of achieving overall the greatest amount of positive phenomenological experience. So what is the foundation for that positive phenomenological experience? It's subjectivity itself. It's sentience. And so I must respect sentience to the greatest overall degree. How do I do that is another question, and you end up in a normative system. So yeah. Overall, I hope that answers your question there. I think you were gay. So yeah, if there's any other questions, I'll be on for the next 5 minutes. It is. We're going at 25 to 12 BST. What's the deal with the course? Only one winner, or will you be holding online seminars for the class? So essentially I'll be selling this course separately, and anyone can purchase it, unlimited amount of people can purchase it. I've been running with the idea of having tutorials that people can kind of pay in for as well as the course. Although I'm kind of on the fence about it, but I'm definitely going to be selling the course as well. I think for a really fair price, because I've been I had to pay over £40,000 for this information and this experience. and I'm really like putting a lot of effort into this and trying to make it as comprehensive as possible, a truly comprehensive introduction to Western philosophy. Obviously, I'll be missing some people out because it's an introduction and I'm not giving you like Western philosophy explained, but yeah, a really good introduction to Western philosophy. There's no donate button in the description, is there not? There very well should be. No, there is a donate button in the description. In case you're interested, like it's also here. So yeah, in case you wanted to tip or anything. But thank you anyway for letting us know. There wasn't actually a donate button at one point, and like in one of the other streams, and it was so frustrating because it just led back to like this weird page, and every time like people were like, there was people in the chat going, the donate button does not work, and I just did not see it. And I was just like, I come out the stream like, oh, no one donate. I suppose like that just happens, you know. And then I read back the chat and I was like, oh, bollocks. People asking to donate, and I'm like, it's like I'm the worst YouTuber. But yeah. What context do you consider yourself an objectivist? I am ontologically objective and epistemologically objective. I believe in like I'm just I'm a Hegelian, if that helps. What's a good intro to Hegel text? Just a short introduction to Hegel by Peter Singer, I think is a really good one. Or you could get Richard Norman, The Philosophy of Right. Not The Philosophy of Right. On the Phenomenology of Spirit. And if you want its ethics, I would say David Rose, A Reader's Guide to the Philosophy of Right. So I hope that answers your question. Would you say that Destiny was coming from sort of some pseudo-libertarian logic? I think Destiny ultimately doesn't... honestly, I don't... I think Destiny's basic... I don't think his logic's necessarily like libertarian. Although it kind of... I mean, to be entirely honest with you, it kind of represents what I would say is a very primary logic of the United States and most of Western society, which is like libertarianism versus liberalism. Like both of them come from that very similar point of social contract theory. The political schemata of a society reflects that. But the United States in particular, because it's liberalism versus libertarianism, whilst many other countries it's like labor movement and socialism versus libertarianism. So the institutions are varied, and you get a variation in the grounding of those arguments. Yeah, so I hope that answers your questions, guys. Yeah, so if there are no more questions, or if anyone wants to quickly ask a question, that'll be the last one, and then I'm going to shoot off. So yeah, first come, first serve. Newest one in the chat. Go. I'm just asking to be trolled. Who are some good deontologists I would recommend reading beside Kierkegaard and Kant? Hegel. Depends on what you mean by deontologist. I think a good book, actually, I'm going to give you a suggestion that is perhaps not like the best, like in terms of deontologists, like, but a good book that I think is good for deontologists in general to argue essentially for their position in reflection to the overall consideration of why they would consider, let's say, their mother or father or whoever is morally closest to them overall in society in reflection to the greatest overall outcome and how moral responsibility works. I'd say like threshold deontology is a good way to enter this, and read a little bit of Ross, The Right and the Good. So yeah, I think that's like something that could be definitely engaged with. Otherwise, I'd probably say like maybe he's like something like I don't know. I quite like. I think we could all do with a little bit more McIntyre in our lives. He's more of a virtue ethicist, but like there is a definite like rule following kind of. I think. Like, but then he does appeal to like where the rules come from, and I would say that's probably like one of the most like he's definitely a virtue ethicist. I'm like he's absolutely a virtue ethicist, but at the same time. When we talk about what comes before the rule, I think is vitally important as well. So like, I guess I'm really just, I'm not even giving you a deontologist yet. I'm telling you what I think deontologists need to read. That's probably not what you asked really, but there you go. So yeah, so I'm gonna shoot off now, guys. If you like this stream, please give it a thumbs up. If you are interested in seeing more content just like this one, please subscribe. If you're interested in winning or having a chance to win my course, please join my Discord server in the link in the Discord. Please click the Discord link below in the description and enter the raffle. And yeah, and if you appreciate that stream and you want to help out the channel, hit the donation link and donate via Streamlabs. Thank you all. I hope you have a lovely night. And